Section 1 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 1. Absent or dead, still let a friend be dear. A sigh the absent claims, the dead a tear. Pope. In the flattest and least agreeable part of the county of Essex, about 5 miles from the sea, is situated a village or small town which may be known in these pages by the name of Longfield. Longfield is distant 8 miles from any market town, but the simple inhabitants, limiting their desires to their means of satisfying them, are scarcely aware of the kind of desert in which they are placed. Although only 50 miles from London, few among them have ever seen the metropolis. Some claim that distinction from having visited cousins in Lothbury and viewed the lions in the Tower. There is a mansion belonging to a wealthy nobleman within 4 miles, never inhabited, except when a parliamentary election is going forward. No one of any pretension to consequence resided in this secluded nook, except the Honourable Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry. She ought to have been the shining star of the place, and she was only its better angel. Benevolent, gentle, and unassuming, this fair sprig of nobility had lived from youth to age in the abode of her forefathers, making a part of this busy world only through the kindliness of her disposition and her constant affection for one who was far away. The mansion of the Fitzhenry family, which looked upon the village green, was wholly incommensurate to our humblest ideas of what belongs to nobility, yet it stood in solitary splendor, the great house of Longfield. From time immemorial its possessors had been the magnates of the village. Half of it belonged to them, and the whole voted according to their wishes. Cut off from the rest of the world, they claimed here a consideration and a deference which, with the moderate income of 1,500 a year, they would have vainly sought elsewhere. There was a family tradition that a Fitzhenry had sat in Parliament, but the time arrived when they were to rise to greater distinction. The father of the lady, whose name has been already introduced, enjoyed all the privileges attendant on being an only child. Extraordinary efforts were made for his education. He was placed with a clergyman near Harwich, and imbibed in that neighbourhood so passionate a love for the sea, that though tardily and with regret, his parents at last permitted him to pursue a naval career. He became a brave, a clever, and a lucky officer. In a contested election, his father was the means of ensuring the success of the government candidate, and the promotion of his son followed. Those were the glorious days of the English Navy, towards the close of the American War, and when that war terminated, and the admiral, now advanced considerably beyond middle life, returned to the Sabine farm, of which he had by course of descent become proprietor, he returned adorned with the rank of a peer of the realm, and with sufficient wealth to support respectably the dignity of the baronial title. Yet an obscure fate pursued the house of Fitzhenry, even in its ennobled condition. The new lord was proud of his elevation as a merited reward, but next to the deck of his ship he loved the tranquil precincts of his paternal mansion, and here he spent his latter days in peace. Midway in life he had married the daughter of the rector of Longfield. Various fates had attended the offspring of this union. Several died, and at the time of his being created a peer, Lord Lodore found himself a widower with 2 children, Elizabeth, who had been born 12 years before, and Henry, whose recent birth had cost the life of his hapless and lamented mother. But those days were long since passed away, and the first Lord Lodore, with most of his generation, was gathered to his ancestors. To the new-sprung race that filled up the vacant ranks, his daughter Elizabeth appeared a somewhat ancient but most amiable maiden, whose gentle melancholy was not, according to innumerable precedents in the traditions regarding unmarried ladies, attributed to an ill-fated attachment, but to the disasters that had visited her house, and still clouded the fortunes of her family. What these misfortunes originated from, or even in what they consisted, was not exactly known, especially at Longfield, whose inhabitants were no adepts in the gossip of the metropolis. It was believed that Mrs. Elizabeth's brother still lived, that some very strange circumstances had attended his career in life was known, but conjecture fell lame when it tried to proceed beyond these simple facts. It was whispered as a wonder and a secret that though Lord Lodore was far away, no one knew where. His lady, as the Morning Post testified in its lists of fashionable arrivals and fashionable parties, was a frequent visitor to London. Once or twice the bolder gossips, male or female, had resolved to sound, as they called it, Mrs. Elizabeth on the subject. But the fair spinster, though inoffensive to a proverb, and gentle beyond the wont of her gentle sex, was yet gifted with a certain dignity of manner and a quiet reserve that checked these good people at their very outset. Henry Fitzhenry was spoken of by a few of the last generation as having been a fine, bold, handsome boy, generous, proud, and daring. He was remembered when, as a youth, he departed for the Continent, as riding fearlessly the best hunter in the field, and attracting the admiration of the village maidens at church by his tall, elegant figure and dark eyes, or when he chanced to accost them by a nameless fascination of manner, joined to a voice whose thrilling silver tones stirred the listener's heart unaware. He left them like a dream, nor appeared again till after his father's death, when he paid his sister a brief visit. There was then something singularly grave and abstracted about him. When he rode, it was not among the hunters, though it was soft February weather, but in the solitary lanes, or with lightning speed over the moors, when the sun was setting and shadows gathered round the landscape. Again, some years after he had appeared among them, he was then married, and Lady Lodore accompanied him. They stayed but 3 days. There was something of fiction in the way in which the appearance of the lady was recorded, an angel bright with celestial hues, breathing heaven, and spreading a halo of calm and light around, as it winged swift way amidst the dusky children of earth. Such ideas seemed to appertain to the beautiful apparition, remembered as Lord Lodore's wife. She was so young that time played with her as a favourite child, so ethereal in look that the language of flowers could alone express the delicate fairness of her skin, or the tints that sat upon her cheek, so light in motion and so graceful. To talk of eye or lip, of height or form, or even of the colour of her hair, the villagers could not, for they had been dazzled by an assemblage of charms before undreamt of by them. Her voice won adoration, and her smile was as the sudden withdrawing of a curtain displaying paradise upon earth. Her lord's tall, manly figure was recollected but as a background, a fitting one, and that was all they would allow to him for this resplendent image. Nor was it remembered that any excessive attachment was exhibited between them. She had appeared indeed but as a vision, a creature from another sphere, hastily gazing on an unknown world, and lost before they could mark more than that void came again, and she was gone. Since that time Lord Lodore had been lost to Longfield. Some few months after, Mrs. Elizabeth visited London on occasion of a christening, and then after a long interval it was observed that she never mentioned her brother, and that the name of his wife acted as a spell to bring an expression of pain over her sedate features. Much talk circulated, and many blundering rumours went their course through the village, and then faded like smoke in the clear air. Some mystery there was. Lodore was gone, his place vacant. He lived, yet his name, like those of the dead, haunted only the memories of men, and was allied to no act or circumstance of present existence. He was forgotten, and the inhabitants of Longfield, returning to their obscurity, proceeded in their daily course, almost as happy as if they had had their lord among them, to vary the incidents of their quiet existence with the proceedings of the great house. Yet his sister remembered him. In her heart his image was traced indelibly, limned in the colours of life. His form visited her dreams, and was the unseen, yet not mute, companion of her solitary musings. Years stole on, casting their clouding shadows on her cheek, and stealing the colour from her hair, but Lodore, was before her in bright youth, her brother, her pride, her hope. To muse on the possibility of his return, to read the few letters that reached her from him, till their brief sentences seemed to imply volumes of meaning, was the employment that made winter nights short, summer days swift in their progress. This dreamy kind of existence, added to the old-fashioned habits which a recluse who lives in a state of singleness is sure to acquire, made her singularly unlike the rest of the world, causing her to be a child in its ways, and inexpert to detect the craftiness of others. Lodore, in exile and obscurity, was in her eyes the first of human beings. She looked forward to the hour when he would blaze upon the world with renewed effulgence, as to a religious promise. How well did she remember, how in grace of person, how in expression of countenance and dignity of manner, he transcended all those whom she saw during her visit to London on occasion of the memorable christening. That from year to year this return was deferred did not tire her patience nor diminish her regrets. He never grew old to her, never lost the lustre of early manhood, and when the boyish caprice which kept him afar was sobered, so she framed her thoughts by the wisdom of time, he would return again to bless her and to adorn the world. The lapse of 12 years did not change this notion, nor the fact that if she had cast up an easy sum in arithmetic, the parish register would have testified her brother had now reached the mature age of 50. End of Volume 1, Chapter 1. Section 2 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 2. Settled in some secret nest, in calm leisure let me rest, and far off the public stage pass away my silent age. Seneca, Marvell's translation. 12 years previous to the opening of this tale, an English gentleman, advanced to middle age, accompanied by an infant daughter and her attendant, arrived at a settlement in the district of the Illinois in North America. It was at the time when this part of the country first began to be cleared, and a newcomer with some show of property was considered a welcome acquisition. Still, the settlement was too young, and the people were too busy in securing for themselves the necessaries of life for much attention to be paid to anything but the overt acts of the stranger, the number of acres which he bought, which were few, the extent of his clearings, and the number of workmen that he employed, both of which were proportionately to his possession in land on a far larger scale than that of any of his fellow colonists. Like magic, a commodious house was raised on a small height that embanked the swift river. Every vestige of forest disappeared from its immediate vicinity, replaced by agricultural cultivation, and a garden bloomed in the wilderness. His laborers were many, and golden harvests shone in his fields, while the dark forest or untilled plain seemed yet to set at defiance the efforts of his fellow settlers, and at the same time comforts of so civilized a description that the Americans termed them luxuries appeared in the abode and reigned in the domestic arrangements of the Englishman, although to his eye everything was regulated by the strictest regard to republican plainness and simplicity. He did not mingle much in the affairs of the colony, yet his advice was always to be commanded, and his assistance was readily afforded. He superintended the operations carried on his own land, and it was observed that they differed often both from American and English modes of agriculture. When questioned, he detailed practices in Poland and Hungary, and gave his reasons why he thought them applicable to the soil in question. Many of these experiments, of course, failed. Others were eminently successful. He did not shun labor of any sort. He joined the hunting parties, and made one on expeditions that went out to explore the neighboring wilds and the haunts of the native Indians. He gave money for the carrying on any necessary public work, and came forward willingly when called upon for any useful purpose. In any time of difficulty or sorrow, on the overflowing of the stream or the failure of a crop, he was earnest in his endeavors to aid and to console. But with all this, there was an insurmountable barrier between him and the other inhabitants of the colony. He never made one at their feasts, nor mingled in the familiar communications of daily life. His dwelling, situated at the distance of a full mile from the village, removed him from out of the very hearing of their festivities and assemblies. He might labor in common with others, but his pleasures were all solitary, and he preserved the utmost independence as far as regarded the sacred privacy of his abode, and the silence he kept in all concerns regarding himself alone. At first the settlement had to struggle with all the difficulties attendant on colonization. It grew rapidly, however, and bid fair to become a busy and large town, when it met with a sudden check. A new spot was discovered a few miles distant, possessing peculiar advantages for commercial purposes. An active, enterprising man engaged himself in the task of establishing a town there on a larger scale and with greater pretensions. He succeeded, and its predecessor sunk at once into insignificance. It was matter of conjecture among them whether Mr. Fitzhenry, so was named the English stranger, would remove to the vicinity of the more considerable town, but no such idea seemed to have occurred to him. Probably he rejoiced in an accident that tended to render his abode so entirely secluded. At first the former town rapidly declined, and many a log hut fell to ruin, but at last, having sunk into the appearance and name of a village, it continued to exist, bearing few marks of that busy, enterprising stir which usually characterizes a new settlement in America. The ambitious and scheming had deserted it. It was left to those who courted tranquillity and desired the necessaries of life without the hope of great future gain. It acquired an almost old-fashioned appearance. The houses began to look weather-worn, and none with fresh faces sprung up to shame them. Extensive clearings, suddenly checked, gave entrance to the forests without the appendages of a manufacture or a farm. The sound of the axe was seldom heard, and primeval quiet again took possession of the wild. Meanwhile, Mr. Fitzhenry continued to adorn his dwelling with imported conveniences, the result of European art, and to spend much time and labor in making his surrounding land assume somewhat of the appearance of pleasure ground. He lived in peace and solitude, and seemed to enjoy the unchanging tenor of his life. It had not always been so. During the first 3 or 4 years of his arrival in America, he had evidently been unquiet in his mind, and dissatisfied with the scene around him. He gave directions to his workmen, but did not overlook their execution. He took great pains to secure a horse whose fiery spirit and beautiful form might satisfy a fastidious connoisseur. Having with much trouble and expense got several animals of English breed together, he was perpetually seen mounted and forcing his way amid the forest land, or galloping over the unencumbered country. Sadness sat on his brow and dwelt in eyes peculiarly expressive of tenderness and melancholy. Pietosi a riguardare amue parce. Often when in conversation on uninteresting topics, some keen sensation would pierce his heart, his voice faltered, and an expression of unspeakable wretchedness was imprinted on his countenance, mastered after a momentary struggle, yet astounding to the person he might be addressing. Generally, on such occasions, he would seize an immediate opportunity to break away and to remain alone. He had been seen, believing himself unseen, making passionate gestures and heard uttering some wild exclamations. Once or twice he had wandered away into the woods and not returned for several days, to the exceeding terror of his little household. He evidently sought loneliness, there to combat unobserved with the fierce enemy that dwelt within his breast. On such occasions, when intruded upon and disturbed, he was irritated to fury. His resentment was expressed in terms ill adapted to republican equality, and no one could doubt that in his own country he had filled a high station in society, and been educated in habits of command, so that he involuntarily looked upon himself as of a distinct and superior race to the human beings that each day crossed his path. In general, however, this was only shown by a certain loftiness of demeanor and cold abstraction which might annoy, but could not be resented. Any ebullition of temper he was not backward to atone for by apology and to compensate by gifts. There was no tinge of misanthropy in Fitzhenry's disposition. Even while he shrunk from familiar communication with the rude and unlettered, he took an interest in their welfare. His benevolence was active, his compassion readily afforded. It was quickness of feeling, and not apathy, that made him shy and retired. Sensibility checked and crushed, an ardent thirst for sympathy which could not be allayed in the wildernesses of America, begot a certain appearance of coldness altogether deceptive. He concealed his sufferings, he abhorred that they should be pried into, but this reserve was not natural to him, and it added to the misery which his state of banishment occasioned. Quiet to quick bosoms is a hell. And so was it with him. His passions were powerful and had been ungoverned. He writhed beneath the dominion of sameness, and tranquillity allied to loneliness possessed no charms. He groaned beneath the chains that fettered him to the spot where he was withering in inaction. They caused unutterable throes and paroxysms of despair. Ennui, the demon, waited at the threshold of his noiseless refuge, and drove away the stirring hopes and enlivening expectations which form the better part of life. Sensibility in such a situation is a curse. Men become cannibals of their own hearts. Remorse, regret, and restless impatience usurp the place of more wholesome feeling. Everything seems better than that which is, and solitude becomes a sort of tangible enemy, the more dangerous because it dwells within the citadel itself. Borne down by such emotions, Fitzhenry was often about to yield to the yearnings of his soul, and to fly from repose into action, however accompanied by strife and wretchedness. To leave America, to return to Europe, and to face at once all the evils which he had journeyed so far to escape. He did not. He remained. His motives for flight returned on him with full power after any such paroxysm, and held him back. He despised himself for his hesitation. He had made his choice and would abide by it. He was not so devoid of manliness as to be destitute of fortitude, or so dependent a wretch as not to have resources in himself. He would cultivate these, and obtain that peace which it had been his boast that he should experience. It came at last. Time and custom accomplished their task, and he became reconciled to his present mode of existence. He grew to love his home in the wilderness. It was all his own creation, and the pains and thought he continued to bestow upon it rendered it doubly his. The murmur of the neighboring river became the voice of a friend. It welcomed him on his return from any expedition, and he hailed the first echo of it that struck upon his ear from afar with a thrill of joy. Peace descended upon his soul. He became enamored of the independence of solitude and the sublime operations of surrounding nature. All further attempts at cultivation having ceased in his neighborhood, from year to year nothing changed except at the bidding of the months, in obedience to the varying seasons. Nothing changed except that the moss grew thicker and greener upon the logs that supported his roof, that the plants he cultivated increased in strength and beauty, and that the fruit trees yielded their sweet produce in greater abundance. The improvements he had set on foot displayed in their progress the taste and ingenuity of their projector, and as the landscape became more familiar, so did 1,000 associations twine themselves with its varied appearances, till the forests and glades became as friends and companions. As he learnt to be contented with his lot, the inequalities of humour and singularities of conduct which had at first attended him died away. He had grown familiar with the persons of his fellow colonists, and their various fortunes interested him. Though he could find no friend tempered like him, nursed in the delicacies and fastidiousness of the societies of the old world, though he, a china vase, dreaded too near a collision with the brazen ones around, yet though he could not give his confidence or unburthen the treasure of his soul, he could approve of, and even feel affection for, several among them. Personal courage, honesty, and frankness were to be found among the men, simplicity and kindness among the women. He saw instances of love and devotion in members of families that made him sigh to be one of them, and the strong sense and shrewd observations of many of the elder settlers exercised his understanding. They opened, by their reasonings and conversation, a new source of amusement, and presented him with another opiate for his too busy memory. Fitzhenry had been a patron of the fine arts, and thus he had loved books, poetry, and the elegant philosophy of the ancients. But he had not been a student. His mind was now in a fit state to find solace in reading, and excitement in the pursuit of knowledge. At first he sent for a few books, such as he wished immediately to consult, from New York, and made slight additions to the small library of classical literature he had originally brought with him on his emigration. But when once the desire to instruct himself was fully aroused in his mind, he became aware how slight and inadequate his present library was, even for the use of one man. Now each quarter brought chests of a commodity he began to deem the most precious upon earth. Beings with human forms and human feelings he had around him, but as if made of coarser, half-kneaded clay, they wanted the divine spark of mind and the polish of taste. He had pined for these, and now they were presented to him. Books became his friends. They, when rightly questioned, could answer to his thoughts. Plato could elevate, Epictetus calm his soul. He could revel with Ovid in the imagery presented by a graceful though voluptuous imagination, and hang enchanted over the majesty and elegance of Virgil. Homer was as a dear and revered friend, Horace a pleasant companion. English, Italian, German, and French all yielded their stores in turn, and the abstruse sciences were often a relaxation to a mind whose chief bane was its dwelling too entirely upon one idea. He made a study also of the things peculiarly befitting his present situation, and he rose in the estimation of those around as they became aware of his talents and his knowledge. Study and occupation restored to his heart self-complacency, which is an ingredient so necessary to the composition of human happiness. He felt himself to be useful, and knew himself to be honored. He no longer asked himself, "Why do I live?" or looked on the dark, rapid waves and longed for the repose that was in their gift. The blood flowed equably in his veins. A healthy temperance regulated his hopes and wishes. He could again bless God for the boon of existence, and look forward to future years, if not with eager anticipation, yet with a calm reliance upon the power of good, wholly remote from despair. End of Volume 1, Chapter 2. Section 3 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 3. Miranda. Alack, what trouble was I then to you? Prospero. Oh, A cherubim thou wast, that did preserve me. The Tempest. Such was the Englishman who had taken refuge in the furthest wilds of an almost untenanted portion of the globe. Like a Corinthian column, left single amidst the ruder forms of the forest oak, standing in alien beauty, a type of civilization and the arts among the rougher, though perhaps not less valuable growth of nature's own. Refined to fastidiousness, sensitive to morbidity, the stranger was respected without being understood, and loved though the intimate of none. Many circumstances have been mentioned as tending to reconcile Fitzhenry to his lot, and yet one has been omitted, chiefest of all. The growth and development of his child was an inexhaustible source of delight and occupation. She was scarcely 3 years old when her parent first came to the Illinois. She was then a plaything and an object of solicitude to him, and nothing more. Much as her father loved her, he had not then learned to discover the germ of the soul just nascent in her infant form, nor to watch the formation, gradual to imperceptibility, of her childish ideas. He would watch over her as she slept, and gaze on her as she sported in the garden, with ardent and unquiet fondness, and from time to time instill some portion of knowledge into her opening mind. But this was all done by snatches and at intervals. His affection for her was the passion of his soul, but her society was not an occupation for his thoughts. He would have knelt to kiss her footsteps as she bounded across the grass, and tears glistened in his eyes as she embraced his knees on his return from any excursion, but her prattle often wearied him, and her very presence was sometimes the source of intense pain. He did not know himself how much he loved her till she became old enough to share his excursions and be a companion. This occurred at a far earlier age than would have been the case had she been in England, living in a nursery with other children. There is a peculiarity in the education of a daughter, brought up by a father only, which tends to develop early 1,000 of those portions of mind which are folded up, and often destroyed under mere feminine tuition. He made her fearless by making her the associate of his rides, yet his incessant care and watchfulness, the observant tenderness of his manner, almost reverential on many points, springing from the difference of sex, tended to soften her mind and make her spirit ductile and dependent. He taught her to scorn pain, but to shrink with excessive timidity from anything that entrenched on the barrier of womanly reserve which he raised about her. Nothing was dreaded, indeed, by her except his disapprobation, and a word or look from him made her, with all her childish vivacity and thoughtlessness, turn as with a silken string and bend at once to his will. There was an affectionateness of disposition kneaded up in the very texture of her soul, which gave it its very form and pressure. It accompanied every word and action, it revealed itself in her voice, and hung like light over the expression of her countenance. Her earliest feeling was love of her father. She would sit to watch him, guess at his thoughts, and creep close or recede away as she read encouragement, or the contrary, in his eyes and gestures. Except him, her only companion was her servant, and very soon she distinguished between them, and felt proud and elate when she quitted her for her father's side. Soon she almost never quitted it. Her gentle and docile disposition rendered her unobtrusive, while her inexhaustible spirits were a source of delightful amusement. The goodness of her heart endeared her still more, and when it was called forth by any demand made on it by him, it was attended by such a display of excessive sensibility as at once caused him to tremble for her future happiness, and love her 10,000 times more. She grew into the image on which his eye doted, and for whose presence his heart perpetually yearned. Was he reading or otherwise occupied, he was restless, if yet she were not in the room, and she would remain in silence for hours, occupied by some little feminine work, and all the while watching him, catching his first glance towards her, and obeying the expression of his countenance before he could form his wish into words. When he left her for any of his longer excursions, her little heart would heave and almost burst with sorrow. On his return she was always on the watch to fly into his arms, and to load him with infantine caresses. There was something in her face that at this early age gave token of truth and affection, and asked for sympathy. Her large brown eyes, such as are called hazel, full of tenderness and sweetness, possessed within their depths an expression and a latent fire which stirred the heart. It is difficult to describe, or by words to call before another's mind, the picture so palpable to our own. The moulding of her cheek, full just below the eyes, and ending in a soft oval, gave a peculiar expression, at once beseeching and tender, and yet radiant with vivacity and gladness. Frankness and truth were reflected on her brow, like flowers in the clearest pool. The thousand nameless lines and mouldings which create expression were replete with beaming innocence and irresistible attraction. Her small chiseled nose, her mouth so delicately curved, gave token of taste. In the whole was harmony, and the upper part of the countenance seemed to reign over the lower and to ennoble it, making her usual placid expression thoughtful and earnest, so that not until she smiled and spoke did the gaiety of her guileless heart display itself, and the vivacity of her disposition give change and relief to the picture. Her figure was light and airy, tall at an early age, and slender. Her rides and rambles gave elasticity to her limbs, and her step was like that of the antelope, springy and true. She had no fears, no deceit, no untold thought within her. Her matchless sweetness of temper prevented any cloud from ever dimming her pure loveliness. Her voice cheered the heart, and her laugh rang so true and joyous on the ear that it gave token in itself of the sympathizing and buoyant spirit which was her great charm. Nothing with her centered in self. She was always ready to give her soul away. To please her father was the unsleeping law of all her actions, while his approbation imparted a sense of such pure but entire happiness that every other feeling faded into insignificance in the comparison. In the first year of exile and despair, Fitzhenry looked forward to the long-drawn succession of future years with an impatience of woe difficult to be borne. He was surprised to find, as he proceeded in the quiet path of life which he had selected, that instead of an increase of unhappiness, 1,000 pleasures smiled around him. He had looked on it as a bitter task to forget that he had a name and country both abandoned forever. Now the thought of these seldom recurred to his memory. His forest home became all in all to him. Wherever he went, his child was by his side to cheer and enliven him. When he looked on her and reflected that within her frame dwelt spotless innocence and filial piety, that within that lovely bower of flesh not one thought or feeling resided that was not akin to heaven in its purity and sweetness, he, as by infection, acquired a portion of the calm enjoyment which she in her taintless youth naturally possessed. Even when any distant excursion forced him to absent himself, her idea followed him to light him cheerily on his way. He knew that he should find her on his return busied in little preparations for his welcome. In summer time the bower and the garden would be adorned. In the inclement season of winter the logs would blaze on the hearth, his chair be drawn towards the fire, the stool for Ethel at his feet, with nothing to remind him of the past save her dear presence, which drew its greatest charm not from that but from the present. Fitzhenry forgot the 1,000 delights of civilization for which formerly his heart had painfully yearned. He forgot ambition and the enticements of gay vanity. Peace and security appeared the greatest blessings of life, and he had them here. Ethel herself was happy beyond the knowledge of her own happiness. She regretted nothing in the old country. She grew up among the grandest objects of nature, and they were the sweet influences to excite her to love and to a sense of pleasure. She had come to the Illinois attended by a black woman and her daughter, whom her father had engaged to attend her at New York, and had been sedulously kept away from communication with the settlers, an arrangement which it would have been difficult to bring about elsewhere. But in this secluded and almost deserted spot the usual characteristics of the Americans were scarcely to be found. Most of the inhabitants were emigrants from Scotland, a peaceable, hard-working population. Ethel lived alone in their lonely dwelling. Had she been of a more advanced age when taken from England, her curiosity might have been excited by the singularity of her position. But we rarely reason about that which has remained unchanged since infancy. Taking it as a part of the immutable order of things, we yield without a question to its control. Ethel did not know that she was alone. Her attendants she was attached to, and she idolized her father. His image filled all her little heart. Playmates she had none, save a fawn and a kid, a dog grown old in her service, and a succession of minor favorites of the animal species. It was Fitzhenry's wish to educate his daughter to all the perfection of which the feminine character is susceptible. As the first step, he cut her off from familiar communication with the unrefined, and watching over her with the fondest care, kept her far aloof from the very knowledge of what might, by its baseness or folly, contaminate the celestial beauty of her nature. He resolved to make her all that woman can be of generous, soft, and devoted, to purge away every alloy of vanity and petty passion, to fill her with honor, and yet to mold her to the sweetest gentleness, to cultivate her tastes and enlarge her mind, yet so to control her acquirements as to render her ever pliant to his will. She was to be lifted above every idea of artifice or guile, or the caballing spirit of the worldling. She was to be single-hearted, yet mild. A creature half poetry, half love, one whose pure lips had never been tainted by an untruth, an enthusiastic being who could give her life away for the sake of another, and yet who honored herself as a consecrated thing, reserved for one worship alone. She was taught that no misfortune should penetrate her soul except such as visited her affections or her sense of right, and that, set apart from the vulgar uses of the world, she was connected with the mass only through another, that other now her father and only friend, hereafter whosoever her heart might select as her guide and head. Fitzhenry drew his chief ideas from Milton's Eve, and adding to this the romance of chivalry, he satisfied himself that his daughter would be the embodied ideal of all that is adorable and estimable in her sex. The instructor can scarcely give sensibility where it is essentially wanting, nor talent to the unpercipient block. But he can cultivate and direct the affections of the pupil, who puts forth as a parasite tendrils by which to cling, not knowing to what, to a supporter or a destroyer. The careful rearer of the ductile human plant can instill his own religion and surround the soul by such a moral atmosphere as shall become to its latest day the air it breathes. Ethel, from her delicate organization and quick parts, was sufficiently plastic in her father's hands. When not with him, she was the playmate of nature. Her birds and pet animals, her untaught but most kind nurse, were her associates. She had her flowers to watch over, her music, her drawings, and her books. Nature, wild, interminable, sublime, was around her. The ceaseless flow of the brawling stream, the widespread forest, the changes of the sky, the career of the wide-winged clouds, when the winds drove them athwart the atmosphere, or the repose of the still and stirless summer air, the stormy war of the elements, and the sense of trust and security amidst their loudest disturbances, were all circumstances to mold her ever unconsciously to an admiration of all that is grand and beautiful. A lofty sense of independence is in man the best privilege of his nature. It cannot be doubted but that it were for the happiness of the other sex that she were taught more to rely on and act for herself. But in the cultivation of this feeling, the education of Fitzhenry was lamentably deficient. Ethel was taught to know herself dependent. The support of another was to be as necessary to her as her daily food. She leant on her father as a prop that could not fail, and she was wholly satisfied with her condition. Her peculiar disposition, of course, tinged Fitzhenry's theories with colours not always their own, and her entire want of experience in intercourse with her fellow creatures gave a more decided tone to her sense of dependence than she could have acquired if the circumstances of her daily life had brought her into perpetual collision with others. She was habitually cheerful even to gaiety, yet her character was not devoid of petulance, which might become rashness or self-will if left to herself. She had a clear and upright spirit, and suspicion or unkindness roused her to indignation or sunk her into the depths of sorrow. Place her in danger and tell her she must encounter it, and she called up all her courage and became a heroine. But on less occasions difficulties dismayed and annoyed her, and she longed to escape from them into that dreamy existence for which her solitary mode of life had given her a taste. Active in person, in mind she was too often indolent, and apt to think that while she was docile to the injunctions of her parent, all her duties were fulfilled. She seldom thought and never acted for herself. With all this, she was so caressingly affectionate, so cheerful and obedient, that she inspired her father with more than a father's fondness. He lived but for her and in her. Away, she was present to his imagination, the lodestone to draw him home, and to fill that home with pleasure. He exalted her in his fancy into angelic perfection, and nothing occurred to blot the fair idea. He, in prospect, gave up his whole life to the warding off every evil from her dear and sacred head. He knew, or rather believed, that while we possess one real, devoted, and perfect friend, we cannot be truly miserable. He said to himself, though he did not love to dwell on the thought, that of course cares and afflictions might hereafter befall her, but he was to stand the shield to blunt the arrows of sorrow, the shelter in which she might find refuge from every evil ministration. The worst ills of life, penury and desertion, she could never know, and surely he who would stand so fast by her through all, whose nightly dream and waking thought was for her good, would even, when led to form other connections in life, so command her affections as to be able to influence her happiness. Not being able to judge by comparison, Ethel was unaware of the peculiarity of her good fortune in possessing such a father, but she loved him entirely, looked up to him, and saw in him the reward of every exertion, the object of each day's employment. In early youth we have no true notion of what the realities of life are formed, and when we look forward it is without any correct estimate of the chances of existence. Ethel's visionary ideas were all full of peace, seclusion, and her father. America, or rather the little village of the Illinois which she inhabited, was all the world to her, and she had no idea that nearly everything that connected her to society existed beyond the far Atlantic, in that tiny isle which made so small a show upon her maps. Fitzhenry never mentioned these things to his daughter. She arrived at the age of 15 without forming a hope that should lead her beyond the pale which had hitherto enclosed her, or having imagined that any train of circumstances might suddenly transplant her from the lonely wilderness to the thronged resorts of mankind. End of Volume 1, Chapter 3. Section 4 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 4. Les déserts sont faits pour les amants, mais l'amour ne se fait pas au désert. Le Barbier de Paris. 12 years had led Ethel from infancy to childhood, and from child's estate to the blooming season of girlhood. It had brought her father from the prime of a man's life to the period when it began to decline. Our feelings probably are not less strong at 50 than they were 10 or 15 years before, but they have changed their objects and dwell on far different prospects. At 35 a man thinks of what his own existence is. When the maturity of age has grown into its autumn, he is wrapped up in that of others. The loss of wife or child then becomes more deplorable as being impossible to repair, for no fresh connection can give us back the companion of our earlier years, nor a new-sprung race compensate for that whose career we hoped to see run. Fitzhenry had been a man of violent passions. They had visited his life with hurricane and desolation. Were these dead within him? The complacency that now distinguished his physiognomy seemed to vouch for internal peace. But there was an abstracted melancholy in his dark eyes, a look that went beyond the objects immediately before him, that seemed to say that he often anxiously questioned fate, and meditated with roused fears on the secrets of futurity. Educating his child and various other employments had occupied and diverted him. He had been content. He asked for no change, but he dreaded it. Often when packets arrived from England, he hesitated to open them. He could not account for his newborn anxieties. Was change approaching? How long will you be at peace? Such warning voice startled him in the solitude of the forests. He looked round, but no human being was near. Yet the voice had spoken audibly to his sense. And when a transient air swept the dead leaves near, he shrunk as if a spirit passed, invisible to sight, and yet felt by the subtle atmosphere as it gave articulation and motion to it. How long shall I be at peace? A thrill ran through his veins. Am I then now at peace? Do love and hate and despair no longer wage their accustomed war in my heart? And is it true that, gently flowing as my days have lately been, that during their course I have not felt those mortal throes that once made life so intolerable a burthen? It is so. I am at peace. Strange state for suffering mortality. And this is not to last? My daughter, there only am I vulnerable, yet have I surrounded her with a sevenfold shield. My own sweet Ethel, how can I avert from your dear head the dark approaching storm? But this is folly. These waking dreams are the curse of inaction and solitude. Yesterday I refused to accompany the exploring party. I will go. I am not old. Fatigue as yet does not seem a burthen. But I shall sink into premature age if I allow this indolence to overpower me. I will set out on this expedition, and thus I shall no longer be at peace. Fitzhenry smiled as if thus he were cheating destiny. The proposed journey was one to be made by a party of his fellow settlers to trace the route between their town and a large one 200 miles off, to discover the best mode of communication. There was nothing very arduous in the undertaking. It was September, and hunting would diversify the tediousness of their way. Fitzhenry left his daughter under the charge of her attendants to amuse herself with her books, her music, her gardening, her needle, and more than all, her new and very favorite study of drawing and sketching. Hitherto the pencil had scarcely been one of her occupations, but an accident gave scope to her acquiring in it that improvement for which she found that she had prodigious inclination, and she was assured no inconsiderable talent. The occasion that had given rise to this new employment was this. 3 or 4 months before, a traveller arrived for the purpose of settling, who claimed a rather higher intellectual rank than those around him. He was the son of an honest tradesman of the city of London. He displayed early signs of talent, and parental fondness gave him opportunities of cultivating it. The means of his family were small, but some of the boy's drawings having attracted the attention of an artist, he entered upon the profession of a painter, with sanguine hopes of becoming hereafter an ornament to it. 2 obstacles were in the way of his success. He wanted that intense love of his art. that enthusiastic perseverance in labor which distinguishes the man of genius from the man of talent merely. He regarded it as a means, not an end. Probably, therefore, he did not feel that capacity in himself for attaining first-rate excellence which had been attributed to him. He had a taste also for social pleasures and vulgar indulgencies, incompatible with industry and with that refinement of mind which is so necessary an adjunct to the cultivation of the imaginative arts. Whitelock had none of all this, but he was quick, clever, and was looked on among his associates as a spirited, agreeable fellow. The death of his parents left him in possession of their little wealth. Depending for the future on the resources which his talent promised him, he dissipated the 200 or 300 pounds which formed his inheritance. Debt, difficulties, with consequent abstraction from his profession, completed his ruin. He arrived at the Illinois in search of an uncle on whose kindness he intended to depend, with $6 in his purse. His uncle had long before disappeared from that part of the country. Whitelock found himself destitute. Neither his person, which was diminutive, nor his constitution, which was delicate, fitted him for manual labor, nor was he acquainted with any mechanic art. What could he do in America? He began to feel very deeply the inroads of despair when, hearing of the superior wealth of Mr. Fitzhenry, and that he was an Englishman, he paid him a visit, feeling secure that he could interest him in his favor. The emigrant's calculations were just. His distinguished countryman exerted himself to enable the young man to obtain a subsistence. He established him in a school, and gave him his best counsels how to proceed. Whitelock thanked him, commenced the most odious task of initiating the young Americans in the rudiments of knowledge, and sought meanwhile to amuse himself to the best of his power. Fitzhenry's house he first made his resort. He was not to be baffled by the reserved courtesy of his host. The comfort and English appearance of the exile's dwelling were charming to him, and while he could hear himself talk, he fancied that every one about him must be satisfied. Fitzhenry was excessively annoyed. There was an innate vulgarity in his visitant, and an unlicensed familiarity that jarred painfully with the refined habits of his sensitive nature. Still, in America he had been forced to tolerate even worse than this, and he bore Whitelock's intrusions as well as he could, seeking only to put such obstacles in the way of his too frequent visits as would best serve to curtail them. Whitelock's chief merit was his talent. He had a real eye for the outward forms of nature, for the tints in which she loves to robe herself, and the beauty in which she is forever invested. He occupied himself by sketching the surrounding scenery, and gave life and interest to many a savage glade and solitary nook, which, till he came, had not been discovered to be picturesque. Ethel regarded his drawings with wonder and delight, and easily obtained permission from her father to take lessons in the captivating art. Fitzhenry thought that of all occupations, that of the pencil, if pursued earnestly and with real taste, most conduced to the student's happiness. Its scope is not personal display, as is the case most usually with music, and yet it has a visible result which satisfies the mind that something has been done. It does not fatigue the attention like the study of languages, yet it suffices to call forth the powers and to fill the mind with pleasurable sensations. It is a most feminine occupation, well replacing on a more liberal and rational scale the tapestry of our grandmothers. Ethel had already shown a great inclination for design, and her father was glad of so favorable an opportunity for cultivating it. A few difficulties presented themselves. Whitelock had brought his own materials with him, but he possessed no superfluity, and they were not to be procured at the settlement. The artist offered to transfer them all, for Ethel's convenience, to her own abode, so that he might have free leave to occupy himself there also. Fitzhenry saw all the annoyances consequent on this plan, and it was finally arranged that his daughter should, 3 or 4 times a week, visit the schoolhouse, and in a little room, built apart for her especial use, pursue her study. The habit of seeing and instructing his lovely pupil awoke new ideas in Whitelock's fruitful brain. Who was Mr. Fitzhenry? What did he in the Illinois? Whitelock sounded him carefully, but gathered no information, except that this gentleman showed no intention of ever quitting the settlement. But this was much. He was evidently in easy circumstances. Ethel was his only child. She was here a garden rose amidst briars, and Whitelock flattered himself that his position was not materially different. Could he succeed in the scheme that all these considerations suggested to him, his fortune was made, or at least he should bid adieu forever to blockhead boys and the dull labors of instruction. As these views opened upon him, he took more pains to ingratiate himself with Fitzhenry. He became humble, he respectfully sought his advice, and while he contrived 1,000 modes of throwing himself in his way, he appeared less intrusive than before, and yet he felt that he did not get on. Fitzhenry was kind to him as a countryman in need of assistance. He admired his talent as an artist, but he shrunk from the smallest approach to intimacy. Whitelock hoped that he was only shy, but he feared that he was proud. He tried to break through the barrier of reserve opposed to him, and he became a considerable annoyance to the recluse. He waylaid him during his walks with his daughter, forced his company upon them, and forging 1,000 obliging excuses for entering their dwelling, he destroyed the charm of their quiet evenings, and yet tempered his manners with such shows of humility and gratitude as Fitzhenry could not resist. Whitelock next tried his battery on the young lady herself. Her passion for her new acquirement afforded scope for his enterprising disposition. She was really glad to see him whenever he came, questioned him about the pictures which existed in the old world, and with a mixture of wonder and curiosity began to think that there was magic in an art that produced the effects which he described. With all the enthusiasm of youth, she tried to improve herself, and the alacrity with which she welcomed her master or hurried to his school looked almost like, Whitelock could not exactly tell what, but here was ground to work upon. When Fitzhenry went on the expedition already mentioned, Ethel gave up all her time with renewed ardor to her favorite pursuit. Early in the morning she was seen tripping down to the schoolhouse, accompanied by her faithful Negro woman. The attendant used her distaff and spindle, Ethel her brush, and the hours flew unheeded. Whitelock would have been glad that her eyes had not always been so intently fixed on the paper before her. He proposed sketching from nature. They made studies from trees, and contemplated the changing hues of earth and sky together. While talking of tints and tones of color spread over the celestial hemisphere and the earth beneath, were it not an easy transition to speak of those which glistened in a lady's eye, or warmed her cheek? In the solitude of his chamber, thus our adventurer reasoned, and wondered each night why he hesitated to begin. Whitelock was short and ill-made. His face was not of an agreeable cast. It was impossible to see him without being impressed with the idea that he was a man of talent, but he was otherwise decidedly ugly. This disadvantage was counterbalanced by an overweening vanity, which is often to be remarked in those whose personal defects place them a step below their fellows. He knew the value of an appearance of devotion, and the power which an acknowledgment of entire thraldom exercises over the feminine imagination. He had succeeded ill with the father, but after all, the surest way was to captivate the daughter. The affection of her parent would induce him to ratify any step necessary to her happiness, and the chance afforded by this parent's absence for putting his plan into execution might never again occur. Why then delay? It was perhaps strange that Fitzhenry, alive to the smallest evil that might approach his darling child, and devoted to her sole guardianship, should have been blind to the sort of danger which she ran during his absence. But the paternal protection is never entirely efficient. A father avenges an insult, but he has seldom watchfulness enough to prevent it. In the present instance, the extreme youth of Ethel might well serve as an excuse. She was scarcely 15, and light-hearted and blithe, none but childish ideas had found place in her unruffled mind. Her father yet regarded her as he had done when she was wont to climb his knee, or to gambol before him. He still looked forward to her womanhood as to a distant event, which would necessitate an entire change in his mode of living, but which need not for several years enter into his calculations. Thus, when he departed, he felt glad to get rid for a time of Whitelock's disagreeable society, but it never crossed his imagination that his angelic girl could be annoyed or injured meanwhile by the presumptuous advances of a man whom he despised. Ethel knew nothing of the language of love. She had read of it in her favorite poets, but she was yet too young and guileless to apply any of its feelings to herself. Love had always appeared to her blended with the highest imaginative beauty and heroism, and thus was in her eyes at once awful and lovely. Nothing had vulgarized it to her. The greatest men were its slaves, and according as their choice fell on the worthy or unworthy, they were elevated or disgraced by passion. It was the part of a woman so to refine and educate her mind as to be the cause of good alone to him whose fate depended on her smile. There was something of the Orondante's vein in her ideas, but they were too vague and general to influence her actions. Brought up in American solitude, with all the refinement attendant on European society, she was aristocratic, both as regarded rank and sex. But all these were as yet undeveloped feelings, seeds planted by the careful paternal hand, not yet called into life or growth. Whitelock began his operations, and was obliged to be explicit to be at all understood. He spoke of misery and despair. He urged no plea, sought no favor, except to be allowed to speak of his wretchedness. Ethel listened. Eve listened to the serpent, and since then her daughters had been accused of an aptitude to give ear to forbidden discourse. He spoke well, too, for he was a man of unquestioned talent. It is a strange feeling for a girl, when first she finds the power put into her hand of influencing the destiny of another to happiness or misery. She is like a magician holding for the first time a fairy wand, not having yet had experience of its potency. Ethel had read of the power of love, but a doubt had often suggested itself of how far she herself should hereafter exercise the influence which is the attribute of her sex. Whitelock dispelled that doubt. He impressed on her mind the idea that he lived or died through her fiat. For one instant vanity awoke in her young heart, and she tripped back to her home with a smile of triumph on her lips. The feeling was short-lived. She entered her father's library, and his image appeared to rise before her, to regulate and purify her thoughts. If he had been there, what could she have said to him, she who never concealed a thought? Or how would he have received the information she had to give? What had happened had not been the work of a day. Whitelock had for a week or two proceeded in an occult and mysterious manner, but this day he had withdrawn the veil, and she understood much that had appeared strange in him before. The dark, expressive eyes of her father she fancied to be before her penetrating the depths of her soul, discovering her frivolity, and censuring her lowly vanity, and even though alone, she felt abashed. Our faults are apt to assume giant and exaggerated forms to our eyes in youth, and Ethel felt degraded and humiliated, and remorse sprung up in her gentle heart, substituting itself for the former pleasurable emotion. The young are always in extremes. Ethel put away her drawings and paintings. She secluded herself in her home, and arranged so well that, notwithstanding the freedom of American manners, Whitelock contrived to catch but a distant glimpse of her during the one other week that intervened before her father's return. Troubled at this behavior, he felt his bravery ooze out. To have offended Fitzhenry was an unwise proceeding at best. But when he remembered the haughty and reserved demeanor of the man, he recoiled trembling from the prospect of encountering him. Ethel was very concise in the expressions she used to make her father, on his return, understand what had happened during his absence. Fitzhenry heard her with indignation and bitter self-reproach. The natural impetuosity of his disposition returned on him like a stream which had been checked in its progress, but which had gathered strength from the delay. On a sudden, the future, with all its difficulties and trials, presented itself to his eyes, and he was determined to go out to meet them, rather than to await their advent in his seclusion. His resolution formed, and he put it into immediate execution. He would instantly quit the Illinois. The world was before him, and while he paused on the western shores of the Atlantic, he could decide upon his future path. But he would not remain where he was another season. The present, the calm, placid present, had fled like morning mist before the new risen breeze. All appeared dark and turbid to his heated imagination. Change alone could appease the sense of danger that had risen within him. Change of place, of circumstances, of all that for the last 12 years had formed his life. How long am I to remain at peace? The prophetic voice heard in the silence of the forests recurred to his memory and thrilled through his frame. Peace! Was I ever at peace? Was this unquiet heart ever still, as one by one the troubled thoughts which are its essence have risen and broken against the barriers that embank them? Peace? My own Ethel! All I have done, all I would do, is to gift thee with that blessing which has forever fled the thirsting lips of thy unhappy parent. And thus, governed by a fevered fancy and untamed passions, Fitzhenry forgot the tranquil lot which he had learnt to value and enjoy, and quitting the haven he had sought, as if it had never been a place of shelter to him, unthankful for the many happy hours which had blessed him there, he hastened to reach the stormier seas of life, whose breakers and whose winds were ready to visit him with shipwreck and destruction. End of Volume 1, Chapter 4. Section 5 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 5. The boy is father of the man. Wordsworth. Fitzhenry, having formed his resolution, acted upon it immediately, and yet, while hastening every preparation for his departure, he felt return upon him that inquietude and intolerable sense of suffering which of late years had subsided in his soul. Now and then it struck him as madness to quit his house, his garden, the trees of his planting, the quiet abode which he had reared in the wilderness. He gave his orders, but he was unable to command himself to attend to any of the minutiae of circumstance connected with his removal. As when he first arrived, again he sought relief in exercise and the open air. He felt each ministration of nature to be his friend, and man in every guise to be his enemy. He was about to plunge among them again. What would be the result? Yet this was no abode for the opening bloom of Ethel. For her good, his beloved and safe seclusion must be sacrificed, and that he was acting for her benefit and not his own served to calm his mind. She contemplated their migration with something akin to joy. We could almost believe that we are destined by Providence to an unsettled position on the globe. So invariably is a love of change implanted in the young. It seems as if the eternal lawgiver intended that at a certain age man should leave father, mother, and the dwelling of his infancy to seek his fortunes over the wide world. A few natural tears Ethel shed. They were not many. She, usually so resigned and quiet in her feelings, was now in a state of excitement. Dreamy, shadowy visions floated before her of what would result from her journey, and curiosity and hope gave life and a bright coloring to the prospect. The day came at last. On the previous Sunday she had knelt for the last time in church on the little hassock which had been hers from infancy, and walked along the accustomed pathway towards her home for the last time. During the afternoon she visited the village to bid adieu to her few acquaintances. The sensitive refinement of Fitzhenry had caused him to guard his daughter jealously from familiar intercourse with their fellow settlers, even as a child. But she had been accustomed to enter the poorer cottages to assist the distressed, and now and then to partake of tea-drinking with the minister. This personage, however, was not stationary. At one time they had had a venerable old man whom Ethel had begun to love. But latterly the pastor had not been a person to engage her liking, and this had loosened her only tie with her fellow colonists. The day came. The father and daughter, with 3 attendants, entered their carriage and wound along the scarcely formed road. One by one they passed, and lost sight of objects that for many years had been woven in with the texture of their lives. Fitzhenry was sad. Ethel wept unconstrainedly, plentiful showery tears, which cost so much less to the heart than the few sorrowful drops which in after life we expend upon our woes. Still, as they proceeded, the objects that met their eyes became less familiar and less endeared. They began to converse, and when they arrived at their lodging for the night, Ethel was cheerful, and her father, mastering the unquiet feelings which disturbed him, exerted himself to converse with her on such topics as would serve to introduce her most pleasantly to the new scenes which she was about to visit. There was one object, however, which lay nearest to the emigrant's heart, to which he had not yet acquired courage to allude. His own position in the world, his former fortunes, and the circumstances that had driven him from Europe to seek peace and obscurity in the wilderness. It was a strange tale, replete with such incidents as could scarcely be made intelligible to the nursling of solitude, one difficult for a father to disclose to his daughter, involving besides a consideration of his future conduct, to which he did not desire to make her a party. Thus they talked of the cities they might see, and the strange sights she would behold, and but once did her father refer to their own position. After a long silence, on his part sombre and abstracted, as Prospero asked the ever-sweet Miranda, so did Fitzhenry inquire of his daughter if she had memory of aught preceding their residence in the Illinois, and Ethel, as readily as Miranda, replied in the affirmative. "And what, my love, do you remember? Gold lace liveries and spacious apartments?" Ethel shook her head. "It may be the memory of a dream that haunts me," she replied, "and not a reality. But I have frequently the image before me of having been kissed and caressed by a beautiful lady, very richly dressed." Fitzhenry actually started at this reply. "I have often conjectured," continued Ethel, that lovely vision was my dear mother, and that when you lost her, you despised all the rest of the world and exiled yourself to America." Ethel looked inquiringly at her father as she made this leading remark, but he, in a sharp and tremulous accent, repeated the words, "Lost her." "Yes," said Ethel, "I mean, is she not lost? Did she not die? Fitzhenry sighed heavily, and turning his head towards the window on his side, became absorbed in thought, and Ethel feared to disturb him by continuing the conversation. It has not been difficult all along for the reader to imagine that the lamented brother of the Honourable Mrs. Elizabeth Fitzhenry and the exile of the Illinois are one. And while father and daughter are proceeding on their way towards New York, it will be necessary for the interpretation of the ensuing pages to dilate somewhat on the previous history of the father of our lovely heroine. It may be remembered that Henry Fitzhenry was the only son of Admiral Lord Lodore. He was from infancy the pride of his father and the idol of his sister, and the lives of both were devoted to exertions for his happiness and well-being. The boy soon became aware of their extravagant fondness, and could not do less in consequence than fancy himself a person of considerable importance. The distinction that Lord Lodore's title and residence bestowed upon Longfield made his son and heir a demigod among the villagers. As he rode through it on his pony, every one smiled on him and bowed to him, and the habit of regarding himself superior to all the world became too much an habit to afford triumph, though any circumstances that had lessened his consequence in his own eyes would have been matter of astonishment and indignation. His personal beauty was the delight of the women, his agility and hardihood the topic of the men of the village. For although essentially spoiled, he was not pampered in luxury. His father, with all his fondness, would have despised him heartily, had he not been inured to hardship and rendered careless of it. Rousseau might have passed his approbation upon his physical education, while his moral nurture was the most perniciously indulgent. Thus, at the same time, his passions were fostered, and he possessed none of those habits of effeminacy which sometimes stand in the gap, preventing our young self-indulged aristocracy from rebelling against the restraints of society. Still, generous and brave as was his father, benevolent and pious as was his sister, Henry Fitzhenry was naturally led to love their virtues, and to seek their approbation by imitating them. He would not wantonly have inflicted a pang upon a human being, yet he exerted any power he might possess to quell the smallest resistance to his desires, and unless when they were manifested in the most intelligible manner, he scarcely knew that his fellow creatures had any feelings at all except pride and gladness in serving him, and gratitude when he showed them kindness. Any poor family visited by rough adversity, any unfortunate child enduring unjust oppression, he assisted earnestly and with all his heart. He was courageous as a lion, and upon occasion soft-hearted and pitiful. But once roused to anger by opposition, his eyes darted fire, his little form swelled, his boyish voice grew big, nor could he be pacified except by the most entire submission on the part of his antagonist. Unfortunately for him, submission usually followed any stand made against his authority, for it was always a contest with an inferior, and he was never brought into wholesome struggle with an equal. At the age of 13 he went to Eton, and here everything wore an altered and unpleasing aspect. Here were no servile menials nor humble friends. He stood one among many, equals, superiors, inferiors, all full of a sense of their own rights, their own powers. He desired to lead, and he had no followers. He wished to stand aloof, and his dignity, even his privacy, was perpetually invaded. His schoolfellows soon discovered his weakness. It became a byword among them, and was the object of such practical jokes as seemed to the self-idolizing boy at once frightful and disgusting. He had no resource. Did he lay his length under some favorite tree to dream of home and independence, his tormentors were at hand with some new invention to rouse and molest him. He fixed his large dark eyes on them, and he curled his lips in scorn, trying to awe them by haughtiness, and frowns and shouts of laughter replied to the concentrated passion of his soul. He poured forth vehement invective, and hootings were the answer. He had one other resource, and that in the end proved successful. A pitched battle or two elevated him in the eyes of his fellows, and as they began to respect him, so he grew in better humour with them and with himself. His good nature procured him friends, and the sun once more shone unclouded upon him. Yet this was not all. He put himself foremost among a troop of wild and uncivilized schoolboys, but he was not of them. His tastes, fostered in solitude, were at once more manly and dangerous than theirs. He could not distinguish the nice line drawn by the customs of the place between a pardonable resistance, or rather evasion of authority, and rebellion against it. And above all, he could not submit to practice equivocation and deceit. His first contests were with his schoolfellows, his next were with his masters. He would not stoop to shows of humility, nor tame a nature accustomed to take pride in daring and independence. He resented injustice wherever he encountered or fancied it. He equally spurned it when practiced on himself, or defended others when they were its object. Freedom was the watchword of his heart. Freedom from all trammels, except those of which he was wholly unconscious, imposed on him by his passions and pride. His good nature led him to side with the weak, and he was indignant that his mere fiat did not suffice to raise them to his own level, or that his representations did not serve to open the eyes of all around him to the true merits of any disputed question. He had a friend at school, a youth whose slender frame, fair effeminate countenance, and gentle habits rendered him ridiculous to his fellows, while an unhappy incapacity to learn his allotted tasks made him in perpetual disgrace with his masters. The boy was unlike the rest. He had wild fancies and strange, inexplicable ideas. He said he was a mystery to himself, he was at once so wise and foolish. The mere aspect of a grammar inspired him with horror, and a kind of delirious stupidity seized him in the classes, and yet he could discourse with eloquence, and pored with unceasing delight over books of the abstrusest philosophy. He seemed incapable of feeling the motives and impulses of other boys. When they jeered him, he would answer gravely with some story of a ghastly spectre, and tell wild legends of weird beings who roamed through the dark fields by night, or sat wailing by the banks of streams. Was he struck, he smiled and turned away. He would not fag, he never refused to learn, but could not. He was the scoff and butt and victim of the whole school. Fitzhenry stood forward in his behalf, and the face of things was changed. He insisted that his friend should have the same respect paid him as himself, and the boys left off tormenting him. When they ceased to injure, they began to like him, and he had soon a set of friends whom he solaced with his wild stories and mysterious notions. But his powerful advocate was unable to advance his causes with his masters, and the cruelty exercised on him revolted Fitzhenry's generous soul. One day he stood forth to expostulate, and to show wherefore Durham should not be punished for a defect. That was not his fault. He was ordered to be silent, and he retorted the command with fierceness. As he saw the slender, bending form of his friend seized to be led to punishment, he sprang forward to rescue him. This open rebellion astounded everyone. A kind of consternation, which feared to show the gladness it felt, possessed the boyish subjects of the Tyro kingdom. Force conquered, Fitzhenry was led away, and the masters deliberated what sentence to pass on him. He saved them from coming to a conclusion by flight. He hid himself during the day in Windsor Forest, and at night he entered Eton, and scaling a wall, tapped at the bedroom window of his friend. "Come," said he, "come with me. Leave these tyrants to eat their own hearts with rage. My home shall be your home." Durham embraced him, but would not consent. "My mother," he said, "I have promised my mother to bear all," and tears gushed from his large, light blue eyes. "But for her, the green grass of this spring were growing on my grave. I dare not pain her." "Be it so," said Fitzhenry. "Nevertheless, before the end of a month you shall be free. I am leaving this wretched place, where men rule because they are strong, for my father's house. I never yet asked for a thing that I ought to have, that it was not granted me. I am a boy here, there I am a man, and can do as men do. Representations shall be made to your parents. You shall be taken from school. We shall be free and happy together this summer at Longfield. Good night, I have far to walk. For the stage coachman would be shy of me near Eton, but I shall get to London on foot, and sleep to-morrow in my father's house. Keep up your heart, Derham. Be a man. This shall not last long. We shall triumph yet. End of Volume 1, Chapter 5. Section 6 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 6. What is youth? A dancing billow winds behind and rocks before. Wordsworth. This exploit terminated Fitzhenry's career at Eton. A private tutor was engaged who resided with the family for the purpose of preparing him for college, and at the age of 17 he was entered at Oxford. He still continued to cultivate the friendship of Derham. This youth was the younger son of a rich and aristocratic family, whose hopes and cares centered in their heir, and who cared little for the comfort of the younger. Derham had been destined for the sea, and scarcely did his delicate health and timid, nervous disposition exempt him from the common fate of a boy whose parents did not know what to do with him. The next idea was to place him in the church, and at last, at his earnest entreaty, he was permitted to go abroad to study at one of the German universities, so to prepare himself by a familiarity with modern languages for diplomacy. It was singular how well Fitzhenry and his sensitive friend agreed. The one looked up with unfeigned admiration, the other felt attracted by a mingled compassion and respect that flattered his vanity and yet served as excitement and amusement. From Derham, Fitzhenry imbibed in theory much of that contempt of the world's opinion and carelessness of consequences which was inherent in the one, but was an extraneous graft on the proud and imperious spirit of the other. Derham looked with calm yet shy superiority on his fellow creatures. Yet superiority is not the word, since he did not feel superior to, but different from. Incapable of sympathizing or extracting sympathy, he turned away with a smile and pursued his lonely path, thronged with visions and fancies, while his friend, when he met check or rebuff, would fire up, his eyes sparkling, his bosom heaving with intolerable indignation. After 2 years spent at Oxford, instead of remaining to take his degree, Fitzhenry made an earnest request to be permitted to visit his friend, who was then at Jena. It was but anticipating the period for his travels, and upon his promise to pursue his studies abroad, he won a somewhat reluctant consent from his father. Once on the continent, the mania of traveling seized him. He visited Italy, Poland, and Russia. He bent his wayward steps from north to south as the whim seized him. He became of age, and his father earnestly desired his return. But again and again he solicited permission to remain, from autumn till spring, and from spring till autumn, until the very flower of his youth seemed destined to be wasted in aimless rambles, and an intercourse with foreigners, that must tend to unnationalize him, and to render him unfit for a career in his own country. Growing accustomed to regulate his own actions, he changed the tone of request into that of announcing his intentions. At length he was summoned home to attend the deathbed of his father. He paid the last duties to his remains, provided for the comfortable establishment of his sister in the family mansion at Longfield, and then informed her of his determination of returning immediately to Vienna. During this visit he had appeared to live rather in a dream than in the actual world. He had mourned for his father, he paid the most affectionate attentions to his sister, but this formed, as it were, the surface of things. A mightier impulse ruled his inner mind. His life seemed to depend upon certain letters which he received, and when the day had been occupied by business, he passed the night in writing answers. He was often agitated in the highest degree, almost always abstracted in reverie. The outward man, the case of Lodore, was in England. His passionate and undisciplined soul was far away, evidently in the keeping of another. Elizabeth, sorrowing for the loss of her father, was doubly afflicted when she heard that it was her brother's intention to quit England immediately. She had fondly hoped that he would, adorned by his newly inherited title, and endowed with the gifts of fortune, step upon the stage of the world, and shine forth the hero of his age and country. Her affections, her future prospects, her ambition were all centered in him, and it was a bitter pang to feel that the glory of these was to be eclipsed by the obscurity and distant residence which he preferred. Accustomed to obedience, and to regard the resolutions of the men about her as laws with which she had no right to interfere, she did not remonstrate, she only wept. Moved by her tears, Lord Lodore made the immense sacrifice of 1 month to gratify her, which he spent in reading and writing letters at Longfield, in pacing the rooms or avenues absorbed in reverie, or in riding over the most solitary districts, with no object apparently in view except that of avoiding his fellow creatures. Elizabeth had the happiness of seeing the top of his head as he leant over his desk in the library, from a little hillock in the garden, which she sought for the purpose of beholding that blessed vision. She enjoyed also the pleasure of hearing him pace his room during the greater part of the night. Sometimes he conversed with her, and then how like a god he seemed! His extensive acquaintance with men and things, the novel but choice language in which he clothed his ideas, his vivid descriptions, his melodious voice, and the exquisite grace of his manner, made him rise like the planet of day upon her. Too soon her sun set. If ever she hinted at the prolongation of his stay, he grew moody, and she discovered with tearful anguish that his favourite ride was towards the sea, often to the very shore. "I seem half free when I only look upon the waves," he said. "They remind me that the period of liberty is at hand, when I shall leave this dull land for blank." A sob from his sister checked his speech, and he repented his ingratitude. Yet when the promised month had elapsed, he did not defer his journey a single day. Already had he engaged his passage at Harwich. A fair wind favoured his immediate departure. Elizabeth accompanied him on board. Almost she wished to be asked to sail with him. No word but that of a kind adieu was uttered by him. She returned to shore and watched his lessening sail. Wherefore did he leave his native country? Wherefore return to reside in lands whose language, manners, and religion were all at variance with his own? These questions occupied the gentle spinster's thoughts. She had little except such meditations to vary the hours as years stole on unobserved, and she continued to spend her blameless, tranquil days in her native village. The new Lord Lodore was one of those men not unfrequently met with in the world, whose early youth is replete with mighty promise, who, as they advance in life, continue to excite the expectation, the curiosity, and even the enthusiasm of all around them. But as the sun on a stormy day now and then glimmers forth, giving us hopes of conquering brightness, and yet slips down to its evening eclipse without redeeming the pledge, so do these men present every appearance of one day making a conspicuous figure, and yet to the end, as it were, they only gild the edges of the clouds in which they hide themselves, and arrive at the term of life, the promise of its dawn, unfulfilled. Passion and the consequent engrossing occupations usurped the place of laudable ambition and useful exertion. He wasted his nobler energies upon pursuits which were mysteries to the world, yet which formed the sum of his existence. It was not that he was destitute of loftier aspirations. Ambition was the darling growth of his soul. But weeds and parasites, an unregulated and unpruned overgrowth, twisted itself around the healthier plant and threatened its destruction. Sometimes he appeared among the English in the capital towns of the continent, and was always welcomed with delight. His manners were highly engaging, a little reserved with men, unless they were intimates, attentive to women, and to them a subject of interest, they scarcely knew why. A mysterious fair one was spoken of as the cynosure of his destiny, and some desired to discover his secret, while others would have been glad to break the spell that bound him to this hidden star. Often for months he disappeared altogether, and was spoken of as having secluded himself in some unattainable district of northern Germany, Poland, or Courland. Yet all these erratic movements were certainly governed by one law, and that was love, love unchangeable and intense. Else wherefore was he cold to the attractions of his fair countrywomen? And why, though he gazed with admiration and interest on the families of lovely girls, whose successive visitations on the continent strike the natives with such wonder, why did he not select some distinguished beauty with blue eyes and auburn locks as the object of his exclusive admiration? He had often conversed with such with seeming delight, but he could withdraw from the fascination unharmed and free. Sometimes a very kind and agreeable mamma contrived half to domesticate him, but after lounging and turning over music books and teaching steps for a week, he was gone, a farewell card probably the only token of regret. Yet he was universally liked, and the ladies were never weary of auguring the time to be not far off when he would desire to break the chains that bound him, and then he must marry. He was so quiet, so domestic, so gentle, that he would make doubtless a kind and affectionate husband. Among Englishmen he had a friend or two, by courtesy so called, who were eager for him to return to his native country and to enter upon public life. He lent a willing ear to these persuasions, and appeared annoyed at some secret necessity that prevented his yielding to them. Once or twice he had said that his present mode of life should not last forever, and that he would come among them at no distant day. And yet years stole on, and mystery and obscurity clouded him. He grew grave, almost sombre, and then almost discontented. Anyone habituated to him might have discovered struggles beneath the additional seriousness of his demeanor, struggles that promised final emancipation from his long-drawn thraldom. End of Volume 1, Chapter 6. Section 7 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 7. Men oftentimes prepare a lot, which ere it finds them is not what suits with their genuine station. Shelley. At the age of 32, Lord Lodore returned to England. It was subject of discussion among his friends whether this was to be a merely temporary visit, or whether he was about to establish himself finally in his own country. Meanwhile he became the lion of the day. As the reputed slave of the fair sex, he found favour in their gentle eyes. Even blooming 15 saw all that was romantic and winning in his subdued and graceful manners, and in the melancholy which dwelt in his dark eyes. The chief fault found with him was that he was rather taciturn, and that, from whatever cause, woman had apparently ceased to influence his soul to love. He avoided intimacies among them, and seemed to regard them from afar with observant but passionless eyes. Some spoke of a spent volcano, others of a fertile valley ravaged by storms, and turned into a desert, while many cherished the hope of renewing the flame, or of replanting flowers on the arid soil. Lord Lodore had just emancipated himself from an influence which had become the most grievous slavery from the moment it had ceased to be a voluntary servitude. He had broken the ties that had so long held him, but this had not been done without such difficulties and struggles as made freedom less delightful from the languor and the regret that accompanied victory. Lodore had formed but one resolve, which was not to entangle himself again in unlawful pursuits, where the better energies of his mind were to be spent in forging deceptions and tranquilizing the mind of a jealous and unhappy woman. He entertained a vague wish to marry, and to marry one whom his judgment rather than his love should select. An unwise purpose, good in theory, but very defective in practice. Besides this new idea of marrying, which he buried as a profound secret in his own bosom, he wished to accustom himself to the manners and customs of his own country. so as to enable him to enter upon public life. He was fond of the country in England, and entered with zeal upon the pleasures of the chase. He liked the life led at the seats of the great, and endeavoured to do his part in amusing those around him. Yet he did not feel one of them. Above all, he did not feel within him the charm of life, the glad spirit that looks on each returning day as a blessing, and which, gilding every common object with its own brightness, requires no lustre unborrowed from itself. All things palled upon Lodore. The light laughter and gentle voices of women were vacant of attraction. His sympathy was not excited by the discussions or pursuits of men. After striving for a whole year to awaken in himself an interest for some one person or thing, and finding all to be vanity, towards the close of a season in town of extreme brilliancy and variety to common eyes, of dullness and sameness to his morbid sense, he suddenly withdrew himself from the haunts of men, and plunging into solitude, tried to renovate his soul by self-communings and an intercourse with silent but most eloquent nature. Youth wasted, affections sown on sand, barren of return, wealth and station flung as weeds upon the rocks, a name whose gold was o'erdusted by the inertness of its wearer, such were the retrospections that haunted his troubled mind. He envied the ploughboy who whistled as he went, and the laborious cottager who each Saturday bestowed upon his family the hard-won and scanty earnings of the week. He pined for an aim in life, a bourne, a necessity to give zest to his palled appetite, and excitement to his satiated soul. It seemed to him that he could hail poverty and care as blessings, and that the dearest gifts of fortune, youth, health, rank, and riches were disguised curses. All these he possessed and despised. Gnawing discontent, energy rebuked and tamed into mere disquietude for want of a proper object, preyed upon his soul. Where could a remedy be found? No green spot of delight soothed his memory, no cheering prospect appeared in view. All was arid, gloomy, unsunned upon. He had wandered into Wales. He was charmed with the scenery and solitude about Rhader Gowy in Rednarshire, which lies amidst romantic mountains, and in immediate vicinity to a cataract of the Wye. He fixed himself for some months in a convenient mansion, which he found to let, at a few miles from that place. Here he was secure from unwelcome visitors, or any communication with the throng he had left. He corresponded with no one, read no newspapers. He passed his day loitering beside waterfalls, clambering the steep mountains, or making longer excursions on horseback, always directing his course away from high roads or towns. His past life had been sufficiently interesting to afford scope for reverie, as he watched the sunbeams as they climbed the hills at evening, or the shadows of the clouds as they careered across the valleys. His heart by turns mourned or rejoiced over its freedom, and the change that had come over it, and stilled its warring passions. The only circumstance that in the least entrenched upon his feelings of entire seclusion was the mention, not unfrequently made to him by his servants, of the ladies at the farm. The idea of these ladies at first annoyed him, but the humble habitation which they had chosen, humble to poverty, impressed him with the belief that, however the ladies might awe-strike the Welsh peasantry, he should find in them nothing that would impress him with the idea of station. 2 or 3 times, at the distant sight of a bonnet, instead of the Welsh hat, he had altered his course to avoid the wearer. Once he had suddenly come on one of these wonders of the mountains. She might have passed for a very civilized kind of Abigail, but of course she was one of the ladies. As Lodore was neither a poet nor a student, he began at last to tire of loneliness. He was a little ashamed when he remembered that he had taken his present abode for a year. However, he satisfied his conscience by a resolve to return to it, and began seriously to plan crossing the country to visit his sister in Essex. He was, during one of his rides, deliberating on putting this resolve into execution on the very next morning, when suddenly he was overtaken by a storm. The valley through which his path wound was narrow, and the gathering clouds overhead made it dark as night. The lightning flashed with peculiar brightness, and the thunder, loud and bellowing, was re-echoed by the hills and reverberated along the sky in terrific pealings. It was more like a continental storm than any which Lodore had ever witnessed in England, and imparted to him a sensation of thrilling pleasure, till, as the rain came down in torrents, he began to think of seeking some shelter, at least for his horse. Looking round for this, he all at once perceived a vision of white muslin beneath a ledge of rock, which could but half protect the gentle wearer. Frightened she was too, as a slight shriek testified, when a bright flash, succeeded instantaneously by a loud peal of thunder, bespoke the presence of something like danger. Lodore's habitual tenderness of nature rendered it no second thought with him to alight and offer his services, and he was fully repaid when he saw her, who hailed with gladness a protector, though too frightened to smile, or scarcely to speak. She was very young, and more beautiful, Lodore was at once assured, than anything he had ever before beheld. Her fairness, increased by the paleness of terror, was even snowy. Her hair, scarcely dark enough for chestnut, too dark for auburn, clustered in rich curls on her brow. Her eyes were dark gray, long and full of expression, as they beamed from beneath their deeply fringed lids. But such description says little. It was not the form of eye or the brows arch, correct, and beautiful as these were in this lovely girl that imparted her peculiar attraction. Beyond these there was a radiance, a softness, an angel look that rendered her countenance singular in its fascination, an expression of innocence and sweetness, a pleading gentleness that desired protection, a glance that subdued because it renounced all victory, and this, now animated by fear, quickly excited in Lodore the most ardent desire to reassure and serve her. She leant as she stood against the rock, now hiding her face with her hands, now turning her eyes to her stranger companion, as if in appeal or disbelief, while he again and again protested that there was no danger, and strove to guard her from the rain, which still descended with violence. The thunder died away, and the lightning soon ceased to flash, but this continued, and while the color revisited the young girl's cheek, and her smiles, displaying 1,000 dimples, lighted up new charms, a fresh uneasiness sprung up in her of how she could get home. Her chaussure, ill-fitted even for the mountains, could not protect her for a moment from the wet. Lodore offered his horse, and pledged himself for its quietness and his care if she could contrive to sit in the saddle. He lifted her light form on to it, but the high-bred animal beginning a little to prance, she threw herself off into the arms of her new friend in a transport of terror, which Lodore could by no means assuage. What was to be done? He felt, light as she was, that he could carry her the short half-mile to her home, but this could not be offered. The rain was now over, and her only resource was to brave the humid soil in kid slippers. With considerable difficulty half the journey was accomplished, when they met the lady whom Lodore had before seen, really the maid in attendance, who had come out to seek her young mistress, and to declare that my lady was beside herself with anxiety on her account. Lodore still insisted on conducting his young charge to her home, and the next day it was but matter of politeness to call to express his hope that she had not suffered from her exposure to the weather. He found the lovely girl, fresh as the morning, with looks all light and sweetness, seated beside her mother, a lady whose appearance was not so prepossessing, though adorned with more than the remains of beauty. She had once struck Lodore as disagreeable and forbidding. Still she was cordial in her welcome, grateful for his kindness, and so perfectly engrossed by the thought of and love for her child that Lodore felt his respect and interest awakened. An acquaintance thus begun between the noble recluse and the ladies of the farm proceeded prosperously. A month ago Lodore would not have believed that he should feel glad at finding two fair offshoots of London fashion dwelling so near his retreat. But even if solitude had not rendered him tolerant, the loveliness of the daughter might well perform a greater miracle. In the mother he found good breeding, good nature, and good sense. He soon became almost domesticated in their rustic habitation. Lady Santerre was of humble birth, the daughter of a solicitor of a country town. She was handsome, and won the heart of Mr. Santerre, then a minor, who was assisted by her father in the laudable endeavour to obtain more money than his father allowed him. The young gentleman saw, loved, and married. His parents were furiously angry and tried to illegalize the match, but he confirmed it when he came of age, and a reconciliation with his family never took place. Mr. Santerre sold reversions, turned expectations into money, and lived in the world. For 6 years his wife bloomed in the gay parterre of fashionable society when her husband's father died. Prosperity was to dawn on this event. The new Sir John went down to attend his father's funeral, thence to return to town to be immersed in recoveries, settlements, and law. He never returned. Riding across the country to a neighbour, his horse shied, reared, and threw him. His head struck against a fragment of stone, a concussion of the brain ensued, and a fortnight afterwards he was enclosed beside his father in the ancestral vault. His widow was the mother of a daughter only, and her hopes and prospects died with her husband. His brother and heir might have treated her better in the sequel, but he was excessively irritated by the variety of debts and encumbrances and lawsuits he had to deal with. He chose to consider the wife most to blame, and she and her child were treated as aliens. He allowed them 200 a year and called himself generous. This was all, for her father was not rich and had a large family that poor Lady Santerre had to depend upon. She struggled on for some little time, trying to keep up her connections in the gay world, but poverty is a tyrant whose laws are more terrible than those of Draco. Lady Santerre yielded, retired to Bath, and fixed her hopes on her daughter, whom she resolved should hereafter make a splendid match. Her excessive beauty promised to render this scheme feasible, and now that she was nearly 16, her mother began to look forward anxiously. She had retired to Wales this summer, that by living with yet stricter economy she might be enabled during the winter to put her plans into execution with greater ease. Lord Lodore became intimate with the mother and daughter, and his imagination speedily painted both in the most attractive colours. Here was the very being his heart had pined for, a girl radiant in innocence and youth, the nursling, so he fancied, of mountains, waterfalls, and solitude, yet endowed with all the softness and refinement of civilized society. Long forgotten emotions awoke in his heart, and he gave himself up to the bewildering feelings that beset him. Everything was calculated to excite his interest. The desolate situation of the mother, devoted to her daughter only, and that daughter fairer than imagination could paint, young, gentle, blameless, knowing nothing beyond obedience to her parent, and untaught in the guile of mankind. It was impossible to see that intelligent and sweet face and not feel that to be the first to impress love in the heart which it mirrored was a destiny which angels might envy. How proud a part was his to gift her with rank, fortune, and all earthly blessings, and to receive in return gratitude, tenderness, and unquestioning submission. If love did not, as thus he reasoned, show itself in the tyrant guise it had formerly assumed in the heart of Lodore, it was the more welcome a guest. It spoke not of the miseries of passion, but offered a bright view of lengthened days of peace and contentedness. He was not a slave at the feet of his mistress, but he could watch each gesture and catch each sound of her voice and say, "Goodness and beauty are there, and I shall be happy." He found the lovely girl somewhat ignorant, but white paper to be written upon at will is a favourite metaphor among those men who have described the ideal of a wife. That she had talent beyond what he had usually found in women, he was delighted to remark. At first she was reserved and shy. Little accustomed to society, she sat beside her mother in something of a company attitude, her eyes cast down, her lips closed. She was never to be found alone, and a jeune personne in France could scarcely be more retired and tranquil. This accorded better with Lodore's continental experience than the ease of English fashionable girls, and he was pleased. He conversed little with Cornelia until he had formed his determination and solicited her mother's consent to their union. Then they were allowed to walk together, and she gained on him as their intimacy increased. She was very lively, witty, and full of playful fancy. Aware of her own deficiencies in education, she was the first to laugh at herself and to make such remarks as showed an understanding worth all the accomplishments in the world. Lodore now really found himself in love, and blessed the day that led him from among the fair daughters of fashion to this child of nature. His wayward feelings were to change no more. His destiny was fixed. At 34, to marry, to settle into the father of a family, his hopes and wishes concentrated in a home adorned by one whose beauty was that of angels, was a prospect that he dwelt upon each day with renewed satisfaction. Nothing in after years could disturb his felicity, and the very security with which he contemplated the future imparted a calm delight at once new and grateful to a heart weary of storms and struggles, and which, in finding peace, believed that it possessed the consummation of human happiness. End of Volume 1, Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 8. Hopes, what are they? Beads of morning strung on slender blades of grass, or a spider's web adorning in a straight and treacherous pass? Wordsworth. The months of July, August, and September had passed away. Lord Lodore enjoyed during the two last a singularly complacent state of mind. He had come to Wales with worn-out spirits, a victim to that darker species of ennui which colors with gloomy tints the future as well as the present, and is the ministering angel of evil to the rich and prosperous. He despised himself, condemned his pursuits, and called all vanity beneath the vivifying sun of heaven. Real misfortunes have worn the guise of blessings to men so afflicted, but he was withdrawn from this position by a being who wore the outward semblance of an angel, and from whom he felt assured nothing but good could flow. Cornelia Santerre was lovely, vivacious, witty, and good-humoured, yet, strange to say, her new lover was not rendered happy so much by the presence of these qualities as by the promise which they gave for the future. He loved her, he believed that she would be to the end of his life a blessing and a delight, yet passion was scarcely roused in his heart. It was a sober certainty of waking bliss, and a reasonable belief in the continuance of this state that made him, while he loved her, regard her rather as a benefactress than a mistress. Benefactress is a strange word to use, especially as her extreme youth was probably the cause that more intimate sympathies did not unite them, and why passion entered so slightly into their intercourse. It is possible, so great was the discrepancy of their age, and consequently of their feelings and views of life, that Lodore would never have thought of marrying Cornelia, but that Lady Santerre was at hand to direct the machinery of the drama. She inspired him with the wish to gift her angelic child with the worldly advantages which his wife must possess, to play a godlike part, and to lift into prosperity and happiness one who seemed destined by fortune to struggle with adversity. Lady Santerre was a worldly woman and an oily flatterer. Lodore had been accustomed to feminine control, and he yielded with docility to her silken fetters. The 9th of October was Cornelia's 16th birthday, and on it she became the wife of Lord Lodore. This event took place in the parish church of Rhyaider Gowy, and it was communicated to the world in the newspapers. Many discussions then arose as to who Miss Santerre could be, the only daughter of the late Sir John. The only late Sir John Santerre remembered was, in fact, the grandfather of the bride, and the hiatus in her genealogy caused by her father's death before he had been known as a baronet puzzled every fashionable gossip. The whole affair, however, had been forgotten when curiosity was again awakened in the ensuing month of March by an announcement in the Morning Post of the arrival of the noble pair at Mivart's. Lord Lodore had always rented a box at the King's Theatre. It had been newly decorated at the beginning of the season, and on the first Saturday in April all eyes turned towards it as he entered, having the loveliest, fairest, and most sylph-like girl that ever trod dark earth leaning on his arm. There was a childlike innocence, a fascinating simplicity, joined to an expression of vivacity and happiness in Lady Lodore's countenance, which impressed at first sight as being the completion of feminine beauty. She looked as if no time could touch, no ill stain her. Artless affection and amiable dependence spoke in each graceful gesture. Others might be beautiful, but there was that in her which seemed allied to celestial loveliness. Such was the prize Lord Lodore had won. The new married pair took up their residence in Berkeley Square, and here Lady Santerre joined them, and took possession of the apartments appropriated to her use under her daughter's roof. All appeared bright on the outside, and each seemed happy in each other. Yet, had any one cared to remark, they had perceived that Lodore looked even more abstracted than before his marriage. They had seen that in the domestic coterie mother and daughter were familiar friends, sharing each thought and wish, but that Lodore was one apart, banished, or exiling himself from the dearest blessings of friendship and love. There might be no concealment, but also there was no frankness between the pair. Neither practised disguise, but there was no outpouring of the heart, no touch of nature, which, passing like an electric shock, made their souls one. An insurmountable barrier stood between Lodore and his happiness, between his love and his wife's confidence. That this obstacle was a shadow, undefined, formless, nothing, yet everything, made it trebly hateful, and rendered it utterly impossible that it should be removed. The magician who had raised this ominous phantom was Lady Santerre. She was a clever, though uneducated woman, perfectly selfish, soured with the world, yet clinging to it. To make good her second entrance on its stage, she believed it necessary to preserve unlimited sway over the plastic mind of her daughter. If she had acted with integrity, her end had been equally well secured, but unfortunately she was by nature framed to prefer the zigzag to the straight line, added to which she was imperious, and could not bear a rival near her throne. From the first, therefore, she exerted herself to secure her empire over Cornelia. She spared neither flattery nor artifice, and well acquainted as she was with every habit and turn of her daughter's mind, her task was comparatively easy. The fair girl had been brought up, how different from the sentiments which Lodore had thought to find the natural inheritance of the mountain child, to view society as the glass by which she was to set her feelings, and to which to adapt her conduct. She was ignorant, accustomed to the most frivolous employments, shrinking from any mental exercise, so that although her natural abilities were great, they lay dormant, producing neither bud nor blossom, unless such might be called the elegance of her appearance, and the charm of the softest and most ingenuous manners in the world. When her husband would have educated her mind, and withdrawn her from the dangers of dissipation, she looked on his conduct as tyrannical and cruel. She retreated from his manly guidance to the pernicious guardianship of Lady Santerre, and she sheltered herself at her side from any effort Lodore might make for her improvement. Those who have never experienced a situation of this kind cannot understand it. The details appear trivial, there seems wanting but one effort to push away the flimsy web, which after all is rather an imaginary than real bondage. But the slightest description will bring it home to those who have known it, and groaned beneath a despotism the more intolerable as it could be less defined. Lord Lodore found that he had no home, no dear single-hearted bosom where he could find sympathy, and to which to impart pleasure. When he entered his drawing-room with gaiety of spirit, to impart some agreeable tidings, to ask his wife's advice, or to propose some plan, Lady Santerre was ever by her side with her hard features and canting falsetto voice, checking at once the kindling kindness of his soul, and he felt that all that he should say would be turned from its right road by some insidious remark, and the words he was about to speak died upon his lips. When he looked forward through the day, and would have given the world to have had his wife to himself, and to have sought in some drive or excursion for the pleasant, unreserved converse he sighed for, Lady Santerre must be consulted, and though she never opposed him, she always carried her point in opposition to his. His wishes were made light of, and he was left to amuse himself, and to know that his wife was imbibing the lessons of one whom he had learnt to despise and hate. Lord Lodore cherished an ideal of what he thought a woman ought to be, but he had no lofty opinion of women as he had usually found her. He had believed that the germ of all the excellencies which he esteemed was to be found in Cornelia, and he found himself mistaken. He had expected to find truth, clearness of spirit, and complying gentleness, the adorning qualities of the unsophisticated girl, and he found her the willing disciple of one whose selfish and artful character was in direct contradiction to his own. Once or twice at the beginning he had attempted to withdraw his wife from this sinister influence, but Lady Lodore highly resented any effort of this kind, and saw in it an endeavour to make her neglect her first and dearest duties. Lodore, angry that the wishes of another should be preferred to his, drew back with disappointed pride. He disdained to enforce by authority that which he thought ought to be yielded to love. The bitter sense of wounded affections was not to be appeased by knowing that if he chose he could command that which was worthless in his eyes except as a voluntary gift. And here his error began. He had married one so young that her education, even if its foundation had been good, required finishing, and who, as it was, had everything to learn. During the days of courtship he had looked forward with pleasure to playing the tutor to his fair mistress, but a tutor can do nothing without authority, either open or concealed. A tutor must sacrifice his own pursuits and immediate pleasures to study and adapt himself to the disposition of his pupil. As has been said of those who would acquire power in the state, they must in some degree follow if they would lead, and it is by adapting themselves to the humour of those they would command that they establish the law of their own will or of an apparent necessity. But Lodore understood nothing of all this. He had been accustomed to be managed by his mistress. He had been yielding, but it was because she contrived to make his will her own. Otherwise he was imperious. Opposition startled and disconcerted him, and he saw heartlessness in the want of accommodation and compliance he met at home. He had expected from Cornelia a girl's clinging fondness, but that was given to her mother. Nor did she feel the womanly tenderness which sees in her husband the safeguard from the ills of life, the shield to stand between her and the world, to ward off its cruelties, a shelter from adversity, a refuge when tempests were abroad. How could she feel this, who, proud in youth and triumphant beauty, knew nothing of and disbelieved the tales which sages and old women tell of the perils of life? The world looked to her a velvet-strewn walk, canopied from every storm. Her husband alone, who endeavoured to reveal the reality of things to her and to disturb her visions, was the source of any sorrow or discomfort. She was buoyed up by the supercilious arrogance of youth, and while inexperience rendered her incapable of entering into the feelings of her husband, she displayed towards him none of that deference and yielding submission which might reasonably have been expected from her youth, but that her mother was there to claim them for herself, and to inculcate as far as she could that while she was her natural friend, Lodore was her natural enemy. He, with strong pride and crushed affections, gave himself up for a disappointed man. He disdained to struggle with the sinister influence of his mother-in-law. He did not endeavour to discipline and invigorate the facile disposition of his bride. He had expected devotion, attention, love, and he scorned to complain or to war against the estrangement that grew up between them. If at any time he was impelled by an overflowing heart to seek his fair wife's side, the eternal presence of Lady Santerre chilled him at once, and to withdraw her from this was a task difficult indeed to one who could not forgive the competition admitted between them. At first he made one or two endeavours to separate them, but the reception his efforts met with galled his haughty soul, and while he cherished a deep and passionate hatred for the cause, He grew to despise the victim of her arts. He thought that he perceived duplicity, low-thoughted pride, and coldness of heart, the native growth of the daughter of such a mother. He yielded her up at once to the world and her parent, and resolved to seek not happiness but occupation elsewhere. He felt the wound deeply, but he sought no cure, and pride taught him to mask his soreness of spirit by a studied mildness of manner, which, being joined to cold indifference and frequent contradiction, soon begot a considerable degree of resentment and even dislike on her part. Her mother's well-applied flatteries and the adulation of her friends were contrasted with his half-disguised contempt. The system of society tended to increase their mutual estrangement. She embarked at once on the stream of fashion, and her whole time was given up to the engagements and amusements that flowed in on her on all sides, while he, one other regret added to many previous ones, one other disappointment in addition to those which already corroded his heart, bade adieu to every hope of domestic felicity, and tried to create new interests for himself, seeking in public affairs for food for a mind eager for excitement. End of Volume 1, Chapter 8. Section 9 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 9. What are fears but voices airy, whispering harm where harm is not, and deluding the unwary till the fatal bolt is shot? Wordsworth. Lord Lodore was disgusted at the very threshold of his new purpose. His long residence abroad prevented his ever acquiring the habit of public speaking, nor had he the respect for human nature, nor the enthusiasm for a party or a cause, which is necessary for one who would make a figure as a statesman. His sensitive disposition, his pride, which when excited verged into arrogance, his uncompromising integrity, his disdain of most of his associates, his incapacity of yielding obedience, rendered his short political career one of struggle and mortification. And this is life, he said, abroad, to mingle with the senseless and the vulgar, and at home to find a wife who prefers the admiration of fools to the love of an honest heart. Within a year after her marriage, Lady Lodore gave birth to a daughter. This circumstance, which naturally tends to draw the parents nearer, unfortunately in this instance set them further apart. Lady Santerre had been near, with so many restrictions and so much interference, which, though probably necessary considering Cornelia's extreme youth, yet seemed vexatious and impertinent to Lodore. All things appeared to be permitted except those which he proposed. A drive, a ride, even a walk with him was to be considered fatal, while at the same time Lady Lodore was spending whole nights in heated rooms and even dancing. Her confinement was followed by a long illness. The child was nursed by a stranger secluded in a distant part of the house, and during her slow recovery the young mother seemed scarcely to remember that it existed. The love for children is a passion often developed most fully in the second stage of life. Lodore idolized his little offspring, and felt hurt and angry when his wife, after it had been in her room a minute or two, on the first approach it made to a squall, ordered it to be taken away. At the time, in truth, she was reduced to the lowest ebb of weakness, but Lodore, as men are apt to do, was slow to discern her physical suffering, while his cheeks burnt with indignation as she peevishly repeated the command that his child should go. When she grew better, this was not mended. She was ordered into the country for air, at a time when the little girl was suffering from some infantine disorder, and could not be moved. It was left with its nurses, but Lodore remained also, and rather suffered his wife to travel without him, so to demonstrate openly that he thought her treatment of her baby unmotherly. Not that he expressed this sentiment, nor did Lady Lodore guess at it. She saw only his usual spirit of contradiction and neglect in his desertion of her at this period. The mother pressed with careless lips the downy cheek of the little cherub and departed, while Lodore passed most of his time in the child's apartment, or turning his library into a nursery, it was continually with him there. Here, he thought, I have something to live for, something to love, and even though I am not loved in return, my heart's sacrifice will not be repaid with insolence and contempt. But when the infant began to show tokens of recognition and affection, when it smiled and stretched out its little hands on seeing him, and crowed with innocent pleasure, and still more, when the lisped paternal name fell from its roseate lips, the father repeated more emphatically, "Here is something that makes it worth while to have been born, to live." An illness of the child overwhelmed him with anxiety and despair. She recovered, and he thanked God with a lively emotion of joy to which he had long been a stranger. His affection for his child augmented the annoyance which he derived from his domestic circle. He had been hitherto sullenly yielding on any contest, but whatever whim or whatever plan he formed with regard to his daughter, he abided by unmoved, and took pleasure in manifesting his partiality for her. Lodore was by nature a man of violent and dangerous passions, added to which his temper was susceptible to irritability. He disdained to cope with the undue influence exercised by Lady Santerre over his wife. He beheld in the latter a frivolous, childish puppet, endowed with the usual feminine infirmities, the love of pleasure and the love of sway, and destitute of that tact and tenderness of nature which should teach her where to yield and how to reign. He left her, therefore, to her own devices, resolved only that he would not give up a single point relative to his child, and consequently, according to the weakness of human nature, ever ready to find fault with and prohibit all her wishes on the subject. Cornelia, accustomed to be guided by her mother's watchful artifices, and to submit to a tyranny which assumed the guise of servitude, felt only with the feelings implanted by her parent. She was not, like Lady Santerre, heartless, but cherished pride, the effect of perpetual misrepresentation, painted her as such. She looked on her husband as a man essentially selfish, one who, worn out by passion, had married her to beguile his hours during a visitation of ennui, and incapable of the softness of love or the kindness of friendship. On occasion of his new conduct with regard to her child, her haughty soul was in arms against him, and something almost akin to hatred sprung up within her. She resented his interference. She believed that his object was to deprive her of the consolation of her daughter's love, and that his chief aim was to annoy and insult her. She was jealous of her daughter with her husband, of her husband with her daughter. If by some chance a word or look passed that might have softened the mutual sentiment of distrust, the evil genius of the scene was there to freeze again the genial current, and any approach to kindness, by an inexplicable but certain result, only tended to place them further apart than before. 3 winters had passed since their marriage, and the 3rd spring was merging into summer, while they continued in this state of warlike neutrality. Any slight incident might have destroyed the fictitious barriers erected by ill will and guile between them, or so precarious was their state, any new event might change petty disagreements into violent resentment, and prevent their ever entertaining towards each other those feelings which, but for one fatal influence, would naturally have had root between them. The 3rd summer was come. They were spending the commencement of it in London, when circumstances occurred, unanticipated by either, which changed materially the course of their domestic arrangements. Lord Lodore returned home one evening at a little after 11 from a dinner party, and found, as usual, his drawing room deserted. Lady Lodore had gone to a ball. He had returned in that humour to moralize which we so often bring from society into solitude, and he paced the empty apartments with impatient step. Home! Yes, this is my home. I had hoped that gentle peace and smiling love would be its inmates, that returning is now from those who excite my spleen and contempt, one eye would have lighted up to welcome me, a dear voice have thanked me for my return. Home! A Tartar beneath his tent, a wild Indian in his hut, may speak of home. I have none. Where shall I spend the rest of this dull, deserted evening? For it may be supposed that, sharing London habits, 11 o'clock was to him but an evening hour. He went into his dressing-room, and casting his eyes on the table, a revulsion came over him, a sudden shock, for there lay a vision which made his breath come thick and caused the blood to recede to his heart. A like vision has had the same effect on many, though it took but the unobtrusive form of a little note, a note whose fold, whose seal, whose superscription were all once so familiar and now so strange. Time sensibly rolled back. Each event of the last few years was broken off, as it were, from his life, leaving it as it had been 10 years ago. He seized the note and then threw it from him. "It is a mere mistake," he said aloud, while he felt even to the marrow of his bones the thrill and shudder as of an occurrence beyond the bounds of nature. Yet still the note lay there, and half as if to undeceive himself and to set witchcraft at naught, he again took it up, this time in a less agitated mood, so that when the well-known impression of a little foreign coronet on the seal met his eye, he became aware that, however unexpected such a sight might be, it was in the moral course of things, and he hastily tore open the epistle. It was written in French, and was very concise. "I arrived in town last night," the writer said. "I and my son are about to join my husband in Paris. I hear that you are married. I hope to see you and your lady before I leave London." After reading these few lines, Lord Lodore remained for a considerable time lost in thought. He tried to consider what he should do, but his ideas wandered as they sadly traced the past, and pictured to him the present. Never did life appear so vain, so contemptible, so odious a thing as now, that he was reminded of the passions and sufferings of former days, which, strewed at his feet like broken glass, might still wound him, though their charm and their delight could never be renewed. He did not go out that night. Indeed, it seemed as if but a minute had passed, when lo, morning was pouring her golden summer beams into his room, when Lady Lodore's carriage drove up, and early sounds in the streets told him that night was gone and the morrow come. That same day Lord Lodore requested Cornelia to call with him on a Polish lady of rank with whom he had formerly been acquainted, to whom he was under obligations. They went, and what Lodore felt when he stood with his lovely wife before her, who for many bygone years had commanded his fate, had wound him to her will through the force of love and woman's wiles, who he knew could read every latent sentiment of his soul, and yet towards whom he was resolved now and for ever in future to adopt the reserved manners of a mere acquaintance. What of tremor or pain all this brought to Lodore's bosom was veiled, at least beyond Cornelia's penetration, who seldom truly observed him, and who was now occupied by her new acquaintance. The lady had passed the bloom of youth and even mid-life. She was verging on 50, but she had every appearance of having been transcendently beautiful. Her dark, full, oriental eyes still gleamed from beneath her finely arched brows, and her black hair, untinged by any grisly change, was gathered round her head in such tresses as bespoke an admirable profusion. Her person was tall and commanding, her manners were singular, for she mingled so strangely stateliness and affability, disdain and sweetness, that she seemed like a princess dispensing the favour of her smile, or the terror of her frown, on her submissive subjects. Her sweetest smiles were for Cornelia, who yet turned from her to another object who attracted her more peculiar attention. It was her son. A youth inheriting all his mother's beauty, added to the fascination of early manhood, and a frank and ingenuous address which his parent could never have possessed. The party separated, apparently well pleased with each other. Lady Lodore offered her services, which were frankly accepted, and after an hour spent together, they appointed to meet again the next day, when the ladies should drive out together to shop and see sights. They became not exactly intimate, yet upon familiar terms. There was a dignity and even a constraint in the Countess Wyzinski's manner that was a bar to cordiality, but they met daily, and Lady Lodore introduced her new friend everywhere. The Countess said that motives of curiosity had induced her to take this country in her way to Paris. Her wealth was immense, and her rank among the first in her own country. The Russian ambassador treated her with distinction, so that she gained facile and agreeable entrance into the highest society. The young Count Casimir was an universal favourite, but his dearest pleasure was to attend upon Lady Lodore, who readily offered to school him on his entrance into the English world. They were pretty exactly the same age. Casimir was somewhat the junior, yet he looked the elder, while the lady, accustomed to greater independence, took the lead in their intercourse, and acted the monitress to her docile scholar. Lord Lodore looked on or took a part in what was passing around him with a caprice perfectly unintelligible. With the Countess he was always gentle and obliging, but reserved, while she treated him with a coldness resembling disdain, yet whose chiefest demonstration was silence. Lodore never altered towards her. It was with regard to her son that he displayed his susceptible temper. He took pains to procure for him every proper acquaintance. He was forward in directing him. He watched over his mode of passing his time. He appeared to be interested in everything he did, and yet to hate him. His demeanour towards him was morose, almost insulting. Lodore, usually so forbearing and courteous, would contradict and silence him, as if he had been a child or a menial. It required all Casimir's deference for one considerably his senior to prevent him from resenting openly this style of treatment. It required all the fascination of Lady Lodore to persuade him to encounter it a second time. Once he had complained to her, and she remonstrated with her husband. His answer was to reprimand her for listening to the impertinence of the stripling. She coloured angrily, but did not reply. Cold and polite to each other, the noble pair were not in the habit of disputing. Lady Santerre guarded against that. Anything as familiar as a quarrel might have produced a reconciliation, and with that a better understanding of each other's real disposition. The disdain that rose in Cornelia's bosom on this taunt, fostered by conscious innocence and a sense of injustice, displayed itself in a scornful smile, and by an augmentation of kindness towards Casimir. He was now almost domesticated at her house. He attended her in the morning, hovered round her during the evening, and she, given up to the desire of pleasing, did not regard, did not even see, the painful earnestness with which Lord Lodore regarded them. His apparent jealousy, if she at all remarked it, was but a new form of selfishness to which she was not disposed to give quarter. Yet any unconcerned spectator might have started to observe how, from an obscure corner of the room, Lodore watched every step they took, every change of expression of face during their conversation, and then, approaching and interrupting them, endeavoured to carry Count Casimir away with him, and when thwarted in this, dart glances of such indignation on the youth, and of scorn upon his wife, as might have awoke a sense of danger, had either chanced to see the fierce lightning-like passions written in those moments on his countenance, as letters of fire and menace traced upon the prophetic wall. The Countess appeared to observe him indeed, and sometimes it seemed as if she regarded the angry workings of his heart with malicious pleasure. Once or twice she had drawn near and said a few words in her native language, on which he endeavoured to stifle each appearance of passion, answering with a smile in a low, calm voice, and retiring, left, as it were, the field to her. Lady Santerre also had remarked his glances of suspicion or fury. They were interpreted into new sins against her daughter, and made with her the subject of ridicule or bitter reproach. Lord Lodore was entirely alone. To no one human being could he speak a word that in the least expressed the violence of his feelings. Perhaps the only person with whom he felt the least inclined to overflow in confidence was the Countess Leszczynski, but he feared her. He feared the knowledge she possessed of his character, and the power she had once exercised to rule him absolutely. The barrier between them must be insuperable, or the worst results would follow. He redoubled his own cautious reserve, and bore patiently the proud contempt which she exhibited, resolved not to yield 1 inch in the war he waged with his own heart with regard to her. But he was alone, and the solitude of sympathy in which he lived gave force and keenness to all his feelings. Had they evaporated in words, half their power to wound had been lost. As it was, there was danger in his meditations, and each one in collision with him had occasion to dread that any sudden overflow of stormy rage would be the more violent for having been repressed so long. One day the whole party, with the exception of Lady Santerre, dined at the house of the Russian ambassador. As Lord and Lady Lodore proceeded towards their destination, he, with pointed sarcasm of manner, requested her to be less marked in her attentions to Count Casimir. The unfounded suspicions of a lover may please as a proof of love, but those of a husband who thus claims affections which he has ceased to endeavour to win are never received except as an impertinence and an insult. Those of Lord Lodore appeared to his haughty wife but a new form of cold-hearted despotism, checking her pleasures whensoever they might arise. She replied by a bitter smile, and afterwards, still more insultingly, by the display of kindness and partiality towards the object of her husband's dislike. Her complete sense of innocence, roused to indignation by the injury she deemed offered to it, led her thus to sport with feelings which, had she deigned to remark, she might have seen working with volcano power in the breast of Lodore. The ladies retired after dinner. They gathered together in groups in the drawing-room, while Lady Lodore, strange to say, sat apart from all. She placed herself on a distant sofa, apparently occupied by examining various specimens of bijouterie, knickknacks of all kinds, which she took up one after another from the table near her. One hand shaded her eyes as she continued thus to amuse herself. She was not apt to be so abstracted as now, that intent on self-examination or self-reproach, or on thoughts that wandered to another, she forgot where she was, and by whom surrounded. She did not observe the early entrance of several gentlemen from the dining-room, nor remark a kind of embarrassment which sat upon their features, spreading a sort of uncomfortable wonder among the guests. The first words that roused her were addressed to her by her husband. "Your carriage waits, Cornelia. Will you come?" "So early?" she asked. "I particularly wish it," he replied. "You can go and send them back for me, and yet it is not worth while. We shall see most of the people here at Lady C's tonight." She glanced round the room. Casimir was not there. As she passed the Countess Leszczynski, she was about to ask her whether they should meet again that evening, when she caught the lady's eye fixed on her husband, meeting and returning a look of his. Alarm and disdain were painted on her face, and added to this a trace of feeling so peculiar, so full of mutual understanding, that Lady Lodore was filled with no agreeable emotion of surprise. She entered the carriage, and the reiterated "home" of Lord Lodore prevented her intended directions. Both were silent during their short drive. She sat absorbed in a variety of thoughts, not one of which led her to enter into conversation with her companion. They were rather fixed on her mother, on the observations she should make to, and the conjectures she should share with her. She became anxious to reach home, and resolved at once to seek Lady Santerre's advice and directions by which to regulate her conduct on this occasion. End of Volume 1, Chapter 9.
Section 10 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 1, Chapter 10. Who then to frail mortality shall trust, but limbs the water, or but writes in dust? Bacon. They arrived in Berkeley Square. Lady Lodore alighted, and perceived with something of a beating heart that her husband followed her. As she passed on to the inner drawing-room, Lady Santerre was not there. Taking a letter from the table, so as to give herself the appearance of an excuse for having entered a room she was almost immediately to quit, she was going, when Lodore, who stood hesitating, evidently desirous of addressing her, and yet uncertain how to begin, stopped her by speaking her name. "Cornelia!" She turned. She was annoyed. Her conscience whispered what was in all probability the subject to which her attention was to be called. Her meditations in the drawing-room of the Russian ambassador convinced her that she had, to use the phrase of the day, flirted too much with Count Casimir, and she had inwardly resolved to do so no more. It was particularly disagreeable, therefore, that her husband should use authority, as she feared that he was about to do, and exact from his wife's obedience what she was willing to concede to her own sense of propriety. She was resolved to hear as little as she could on the subject, and stood as if in haste to go. His faltering voice betrayed how much he felt, and once or twice it refused to frame the words he desired to utter. How different was their import from that expected by his impatient auditress. "Cornelia," said he at length, "can you immediately and at once, this very night, prepare to quit England?" "Quit England? Why, whither?" she exclaimed. "I scarcely know," replied Lodore, "nor is it of the slightest import. The world is wide, a shelter, a refuge can be purchased anywhere, and that is all I seek." The gaming table, the turf, loss of fortune, were the ideas naturally conveyed into the lady's mind by this reply. "Is everything gone, lost?" she asked. "My honour is," he answered with an effort, "and the rest is of little worth." He paused, and then continued in a low but distinct voice, as if every word cost him a struggle, and yet as if he wished each one to be fraught with its entire meaning to his hearer. "I cannot well explain to you the motives of my sudden determination, nor will I complain of the part you have had in bringing on this catastrophe. It is over now. No power on earth, no heavenly power, can erase the past, nor change one iota of what but an hour ago did not exist, but which now exists, altering all things to both of us forever. I am a dishonoured man." "Speak without more comment," cried Lady Lodore. "For heaven's sake, explain. I must know what you mean." "I have insulted a gentleman," replied her husband, "and I will yield no reparation. I have disgraced a nobleman by a blow, and I will offer no apology, nor could one be accepted, and it could not, nor will I give satisfaction." Lady Lodore remained silent. Her thoughts speedily ran over the dire objects which her husband's speech presented. A quarrel, she too readily guessed with whom, a blow, a duel. Her cheek blanched, yet not so, for Lodore refused to fight. in spite of the terror with which an anticipated re-encounter had filled her. The idea of cowardice in her husband, or the mere accusation of it, brought the colour back to her face. She felt that her heedlessness had given rise to all this harm. But again she felt insulted that doubts of her sentiments or conduct should be the occasion of a scene of violence. Both remained silent. Lodore stood leaning on the mantelpiece, his cheeks flushed, agitation betraying itself in each gesture, mixed with a resolve to command himself. Cornelia had advanced from the door to the middle of the room. She stood irresolute, too indignant and too fearful to ask further explanation, and yet anxious to receive it. Still he hesitated. He was desirous of finding some form of words which might convey all the information that it was necessary she should receive, and yet conceal all that he desired should remain untold. At last he spoke. "It is unnecessary to allude to the irretrievable past. The future is not less unalterable for me. I will not fight with, nor apologize to, the boy I have insulted. I must therefore fly my country and the face of man, go where the name of Lodore will not be synonymous with infamy. To an island in the East, to the desert wilds of America, it matters not whither. The simple question is, whether you are prepared on a sudden to accompany me. I would not ask this of your generosity, but that, married as we are, our destinies are linked far beyond any power we possess to sunder them. Miserable as my future fortunes will be, far other than those which I invited you but 4 years ago to share, you are better off incurring the worst with me than you could be struggling alone for a separate existence." "Pardon me, Lodore," said Cornelia, somewhat subdued by the magnitude of the crisis brought about, she believed, however involuntarily, by herself, and by the sadness that, as he spoke, filled the dark eyes of her companion with an expression more melancholy than tears. "Pardon me if I seek for further explanation. Your antagonist," they neither of them ventured to speak a name which hung on the lips of both, "is a mere boy. Your refusal to fight with him results, of course, from this consideration. While angry, and if I must allude to so distasteful a falsehood, while unjust suspicion prevent your making him fitting and most due concessions, were the occasion less terrible, I might disdain to assert my own innocence. But as it is, I do most solemnly declare that Count Casimir—" "I ask no question on that point, but simply wish to know whether you will accompany me," interrupted Lodore hastily. "The rest I am sorry for, but it is over. You, my poor girl, though in some measure the occasion, and altogether the victim of this disaster, can exercise no control over it. No foreign noble would accept the most humiliating submissions as compensation for a blow, and this urchin shall never receive from me the shadow of any." "Is there no other way?" asked Cornelia. "Not any," replied Lodore, while his agitation increased and his voice grew tremulous. "No consideration on earth could arm me against his life. One other mode there is. I might present myself as a mark for his vengeance, with the design of not returning his fire. But I am shut out even from this resource. And this," continued Lodore, losing as he spoke all self-command, carried away by the ungovernable passions he had hitherto suppressed, and regardless, as he strode up and down the room, of Cornelia, who, half terrified, had sunk into a chair, "these are the result of my crimes. Such, from their consequences, I now term, by what courtesy I have hitherto named my follies. This is the end, bringing into frightful collision those who are bound by sacred ties, changing natural love into unnatural, deep-rooted, unspeakable hate, arming blood against kindred blood, and making the innocent a parricide. Oh, Theodora, what have you not to answer for?" Lady Lodore started. The image he presented was too detestable. She repressed her emotions, and assuming the air of disdain, which we are so apt to adopt to colour more painful feelings, she said, "This sounds very like a German tragedy, being at once disagreeable and inexplicable." "It is a tragedy," he replied, "a tragedy brought now to its last dark catastrophe. Casimir is my son. We may neither of us murder the other, nor will I, if again brought into contact with him, do other than chastise the insolent boy. The tiger is roused within me. You have a part in this." A flash of anger glanced from Cornelia's eyes. She did not reply. She rose. She quitted the room. She passed on with apparent composure till reaching the door of her mother's chamber. She rushed impetuously in. Overcome with indignation, panting, choked, she threw herself into her arms, saying, "Save me!" A violent fit of hysterics followed. At first Lady Lodore could only speak of the injury and insult she had herself suffered, and Lady Santerre, who by no means wished to encourage feelings which might lead to violence in action, tried to soothe her irritation. But when allusions to Lodore's intention of quitting England and the civilized world for ever mingled with Cornelia's exclamations, the affair assumed a new aspect in the wary lady's eyes. The barbarity of such an idea excited her utmost resentment. At once she saw the full extent of the intended mischief, and the risk she incurred of losing the reward of years of suffering and labour. When an instantaneous departure was mentioned, an endless, desolate journey, which it was doubtful whether she should be admitted to share, to be commenced that very night, she perceived that her measures to prevent it must be promptly adopted. The chariot was still waiting which was to have conveyed Lord and Lady Lodore to their assembly. Dressed as she was for this without preparation, she hurried her daughter into the carriage, and bade the coachman drive to a villa they rented at Twickenham, leaving in explanation these few lines addressed to her son-in-law. The scene of this evening has had an alarming effect upon Cornelia. Time will soften the violence of her feelings, but some immediate step was necessary to save, I verily believe, her life. I take her to Twickenham, and will endeavour to calm her. Until I shall have in some measure succeeded, I think you had better not follow us, but let us hear from you, for although my attention is so painfully engrossed by my daughter's sufferings, I am distressed on your account also, and shall continue very uneasy until I hear from you. Friday evening. Lady Santerre and her daughter reached Twickenham. Lady Lodore went to bed, and, assisted by a strong composing draught administered by her mother, her wrongs and her anger were soon hushed in profound sleep. Night, or rather morning, was far spent before this occurred, so that it was late in the afternoon of the ensuing day before she awoke, and recalled to her memory the various conflicting sentiments which had occupied her previous to her repose. During the morning, Lady Santerre had dispatched a servant to Berkeley Square, to summon her daughter's peculiar attendants. He now brought back the intelligence that Lord Lodore had departed for the Continent about 3 hours after his wife had quitted his house. But to this he added tidings of another circumstance, for which both ladies were totally unprepared. Cornelia had entered the carriage the preceding night without spending one thought on the sleeping cherub in the nursery. What was her surprise and indignation when she heard that her child and its attendant formed a part of his lordship's travelling suite. The mother's first impulse was to follow her offspring, but this was speedily exchanged for a bitter sense of wrong, aversion to her husband, and a resolve not to yield one point in the open warfare thus declared by him. End of Volume 1, Chapter 10. Section 11 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 1, Chapter 11. Amid two seas, on one small point of land, wearied, uncertain, and amazed we stand. On either side our thoughts incessant turn. Forward we dread, and looking back we mourn. Prior. Accustomed to obey the more obvious laws of necessity, those whose situation in life obliges them to earn their daily bread are already broken into the yoke of fate. But the rich and great are vanquished more slowly. Their time is their own. As fancy bids them, they can go east, west, north, or south. They wish and accomplish their wishes, and cloyed by the too easy attainment of the necessaries, and even of the pleasures of life, they fly to the tortures of passion, and to the labor of overcoming the obstacles that stand in the way of their forbidden desires, as resources against ennui and satiety. Reason is lost in the appetite for excitement, and a kind of unnatural pleasure springs from their severest pains, because thus alone are they roused to a full sense of their faculties. Thus alone is existence and its purposes brought home to them. In the midst of this, their thoughtless career, the eternal law which links ill to ill is at hand to rebuke and tame the rebel spirit. And such a tissue of pain and evil is woven from their holiday pastime as checks them mid-course, and makes them feel that they are slaves. The young are scarcely aware of this. They delight to contend with fate, and laugh as she clanks their chains. But there is a period, sooner or later comes to all, when the link envelops them, the bolts are shot, the rivets fixed, the iron enters the flesh, the soul is subdued, and they fly to religion or proud philosophy to seek for an alleviation, which the crushed spirit can no longer draw from its own resources. This hour, this fatal hour, how many can point to the shadow on the dial and say, "Then it was that I felt the whole weight of my humanity, and knew myself to be the subject of an unvanquishable power." This dark moment had arrived for Lodore. He had spent his youth in passion, and exhausted his better nature in a struggle for, and in the enjoyment of, pleasure. He found disappointment, and desired change. It came at his beck. He married. He was not satisfied. But still he felt that it was because he did not rouse himself that the bonds sate so heavily upon him. He was enervated. He sickened at the idea of the struggle it would require to cast off his fetters, and he preferred adapting his nature to endure their weight. But he believed that it was only because he did not raise his hand, nor determine on one true effort, that he was thus enslaved. And now his hand was raised, the effort made, but no change ensued, and he felt that there was no escape from the inextricable bonds that fastened him to misery. He had believed that he did right in introducing his wife to the Countess Lyzinski. He felt that he could not neglect this lady, and such was her rank, that any affectation of a separate acquaintance would invite those observations which he depreciated. It was, after all, matter of trivial import that he should be the person to bring them acquainted. Moving in the same circles, they must meet. They might clash. It was better that they should be on friendly terms. He did not foresee the intimacy that ensued, and still less that his own violent passions would be called into action. That they were so was to the end a mystery even to himself. He no longer loved the Countess, and in the solitude of his chamber he often felt his heart yearn toward the noble youth, her son. But when they met, When Cornelia spent her blandest smiles upon him, and when the exquisitely beautiful countenance of Casimir became lighted up with gladness and gratitude, a fire of rage was kindled in his heart, and he could no more command himself than can the soaring flames of a conflagration bend earthward. He felt ashamed, but new fury sprung from this very sensation. For worlds he would not have his frenzy pried into by another, and yet he had no power to control its manifestation. His wife expostulated with him concerning Casimir, and laughed his rebuke to scorn, but she did not read the tumult of unutterable jealousy and hate that slept within his breast, like an earthquake beneath the soil the day before a city falls. All tended to add fuel to this unnatural flame. His own exertions to subdue its fierceness but kindled it anew. Often he entered the same room with the young Count, believing that he had given his suspicion to the winds, that he could love him as a son, and rejoice with a father's pride in the graces of his figure, and the noble qualities of his mind. For a few seconds the fiction endured. He felt a pang. It was nothing. Gone. It would not return again. Another. Was he for ever to be thus tortured? And then a word, a look, an appearance of slighting him on the part of Casimir, an indiscreet smile on Cornelia's lips, would at once set alight the whole devastating blaze. The Countess alone had any power over him, but though he yielded to her influence, he was the more enraged that she should behold his weakness, and that while he succeeded in maintaining an elevated impassibility with regard to herself, his heart, with all its flaws and poverty of purpose, should, through the ill-timed interference of this boy, be placed once more naked in her hand. Such a state of feeling, where passion combated passion, while reason was forgotten in the strife, was necessarily pregnant with ruin. The only safety was in flight, and Lodore would have flown. He would have absented himself until the cause of his sufferings had departed, but that more and more jealousy entered into his feelings, a jealousy wound up by the peculiarity of his situation into a sensitiveness that bordered on insanity, which saw guilt in a smile, and overwhelming hopeless ruin in the simplest expression of kindness. Cornelia herself was disinclined to quit London, and tenacious pride rendered him adverse to proposing it, since he could frame no plausible pretext for his change of purpose, and it had been previously arranged that they should remain till the end of July. The presence of the Countess Lyzinski was a tie to keep her, and to have pleaded his feelings with regard to Casimir, could he have brought himself so to do, would probably have roused her at once into rebellion. There was no resource. He must bear, and also he must forbear, but the last was beyond his power, and his attempt at first brought with it destruction. In the last instance, at the Russian ambassador's, irritated by Cornelia's tone of defiance and subsequent levity, he levelled a scornful remark at the guiltless and unconscious offender. Casimir had endured his arrogance and injustice long. He knew of no tie, no respect due beyond that which youth owes to maturer years, and yet the natural sweetness of his disposition inclined him to forbearance, until now that, surrounded by his own countrymen and by Russians, it became necessary that he should assert himself. He replied with haughtiness. Lodore rejoined with added insult, and when again Casimir retorted, he struck him. The young noble's eyes flashed fire. Several gentlemen interposed between them, and yielding to the expediency of the moment, the Pole, with admirable temper, withdrew. Humiliated and dismayed, but still burning with fury, Lodore saw at once the consequences of his angry transport. With all the impetuosity of his fiery spirit, he resolved to quit at once the scene in which he had played his part so ill. There was no other alternative. The most frightful crimes blocked up every other outlet. This was his sole escape, and he must seize on it without delay. Lady Lodore had not even deigned to answer his request that she should accompany him, and her mother's note appeared the very refinement of insolence. They abandoned him. They left the roof from which he was about to exile himself, even before he had quitted it, as if in fear of contamination during his brief delay. Thus he construed their retreat, and worked up as he was almost to madness, he considered their departure as the commencement of that universal ban which for ever hereafter was to accompany his name. It opened anew the wound his honour had sustained, and he poured forth a vow never more to ally himself in bonds of love or amity with one among his kind. His purpose was settled, and he did not postpone its execution. Post-horses were ordered, and hasty preparations made for his departure. Alone, abandoned, disgraced, in another hour he was to quit his home, his wife, all that endears existence for ever. Yet the short interval that preceded his departure hung like a long-drawn day upon him, and time seemed to make a full stop at a period when he would have rejoiced had it leaped many years to come. The heart's prayer in agony did not avail. He was still kept lingering when a knocking at the door announced a visitor who at that late hour could come for one purpose only. Lord Lodore ordered himself to be denied, and Count Casimir's second departed to seek him elsewhere. Cold dewdrops stood on Lodore's brow as he heard this gentleman parley in a foreign accent with the servant, trying doubtless to make out where it was likely that he should meet with him. The door closed at last, and he listened to the departing steps of his visitor, who could scarcely have left the square before his travelling chariot drove up. And now, while final arrangements were making, with a heavy heart from bitter self-condemnation, he visited the couch of his sleeping daughter, once more to gaze on her sweet face, and for the last time to bestow a father's blessing on her. The early summer morning was abroad in the sky, and as he opened her curtains, the first sunbeam played upon her features. He stooped to kiss her little rosy lips. And I leave this spotless being to the blighting influence of that woman. His murmurs disturbed the child's slumbers. She woke and smiled to see her father, and then insisted upon rising as he was up and it was day. "But I am come to say good-bye, sweet," he said. "I am going on a long journey." "Oh, take me with you," cried the little girl, springing up and fastening her arms round his neck. He felt her soft cheek pressed to his, her hands trying to hold fast, and to resist his endeavours to disengage them. His heart warmed within him. "For a short distance I may indulge myself," he said, and he thought how her prattle would solace his darker cares during his road to Southampton. So, causing her attendant to make speedy preparation, he took her in the carriage with him, and her infantine delight so occupied him that he scarcely remembered his situation, or what exactly he was doing, as he drove for the last time through the lightsome and deserted streets of the metropolis. And now he had quitted these, and the country in all its summer beauty opened around him, meadows and fields with their hedgerows, tufted groves crowning the uplands, and the blue sky bent over all. "From these they cannot banish me," he thought. "In spite of dishonour and infamy, the loveliness of nature and the freedom of my will still are mine. And is this all?" His child had sunk to sleep, nestled close in his arms. "Ah, what will these be to me when I have lost this treasure, dearest of all? Yet why lose her?" This question, when it first presented itself to him, he put aside as one that answered itself. To deprive a mother of her child were barbarity beyond that of savages. But again and again it came across him, and he began to reason with it, and to convince himself that he should be unjust towards himself in relinquishing this last remaining blessing. His arguments were false, his conclusions rash and selfish, but of this he was not aware. Our several minds, in reflecting to our judgments the occurrences of life, are like mirrors of various shapes and hues, so that we none of us perceive passing objects with exactly similar optics. And while all pretend to regulate themselves by the quadrant of justice, the deceptive medium through which the reality is viewed causes our ideas of it to be at once various and false. This is the case in immaterial points. How much more so when self-love magnifies and passion obscures the glass through which we look upon others and ourselves. The chief task of the philosopher is to purify and correct the intellectual prism, but Lodore was the reverse of a philosopher, and the more he gazed and considered, the more imperfect and distorted became his perception. To act justly by ourselves and others is the aim of every well-conditioned mind, for the sight of pain in our fellow creatures and the sense of self-condemnation within ourselves is fraught with a pang from which we would willingly escape. And every heart not formed of the coarsest materials is keenly alive to such emotions. Lodore resolved to judge calmly, and he reviewed coolly, and weighed, he believed, impartially, the various merits of the question. He thought of Lady Santerre's worldliness, her vulgar ambition, her low-born contempt for all that is noble and elevating in human nature. He thought of Cornelia's docility to her mother's lessons, her careless disregard of the nobler duties of life, and of her frivolity and unfeeling nature. And then, almost against his will, his own many excellencies rose before him, his lofty aspirations, his self-sacrifice for the good of others, the affectionateness of his disposition, his mildness, his desire to be just and kind to all, his willingness to devote every hour of the day and every thought of his mind to the well bringing up of his daughter. A person must be strangely blind who did not perceive that, as far as the child was concerned, she would be far better off with him. And then, in another point of view, Lady Lodore had her mother, and she had the world. She had not only beauty, rank, and wealth, but she had a taste for enjoying the advantages yielded by these on the common soil of daily life. He cared for nothing in the wide world. He loved nothing but this little child. He would willingly exchange for her the far greater portion of his fortune which Lady Lodore should enjoy, reserving for himself such a pittance merely as would suffice for his own and his daughter's support. He had neither home, nor friends, nor youth, nor taintless reputation, nor any of all the blessings of life of which Cornelia possessed a superabundance. Her child was as nothing in the midst of these. She had left her without a sigh, even without a thought, while but to imagine the moment of parting was a dagger to her father's heart. What a fool he had been to hesitate so long, to hesitate at all! There she was, this angel of comfort. Her little form was cradled in his arms. He felt her soft breath upon his hand, and the regular heaving of her bosom responded to the beatings of his own heart. Her golden glossy hair, her crimson cheek, her soft round limbs, all this matchless bower of flesh that held in the budding soul and already expanding affectations of this earthly cherub, was with him. And had he imagined that he could part with her? Rather would he return to Lady Lodore, to dishonour, to scenes of hate and of the world's contempt, so that thus he preserved her. It could not be required of him. But if Cornelia's heart was animated by a tithe of the fondness that warmed his, she would not hesitate in her choice, but, discarding every unworthy feeling, follow her child into the distant and solitary abode he was about to select. And thus pacifying his conscience, Lodore came to the conclusion of making his daughter the partner of his exile. Soon after midday they arrived at Southampton. A small vessel was on the point of sailing for Havre, and on board this he hurried. Before he went, he gave one hasty retrospective view to those he was leaving behind: his wife, his sister, the filial antagonist from whom he was flying. He could readily address himself to the first of these when landed on the opposite coast, but as he wished to keep his destination a secret from the latter, and to prevent, if possible, his being followed and defied by him, an event still to be feared, he employed the few remaining minutes before quitting his country for ever in writing a brief letter to the Countess Lyzinski, which he gave in charge to a servant whom he dismissed and sent back to town. And thus he now addressed her, who in his early life had been as the moon to raise the tide of passion, incapable, alas, of controlling its waves when at the full. It is all over. I have fulfilled my part. The rest remains with you. To prevent the ruin which my folly has brought down from crushing any but myself, I quit country, home, good name, all that is dear to man. I do not complain, nor will I repine, but let the evil, I entreat you, stop here. Casimir must not follow me. He must not know whither I am gone, and while he brands his antagonist with the name of coward, he must not guess that for his sake I endure this stain. I leave it to your prudence and sagacity to calm or to mislead him, to prevent his suspecting the truth or rashly seeking my life. I sacrifice more, far more than my heart's blood on his account. Let that satisfy even your vengeance. I would not write harshly. The dream of life has long been over for me. It matters not how or when the last sands flow out. I do not blame you even for this ill-omened journey to England, which could avail you nothing. Once before we parted for ever, Theodora, but that separation was as the pastime of children in comparison with the tragic scene we now enact. 1,000 dangers yawn between us, and we shall neither dare to repass the gulf that divides us. Forget me, be happy, and forget me. May Casimir be a blessing to you, and while you glory in his perfections and prosperity, cast into oblivion every thought of him who now bids you an eternal adieu. End of Volume 1, Chapter 11.